The candle flames bent sideways when Duke Caedric Valagrave entered the imperial throne room, as if even fire recognized a force more dangerous than itself. 200 nobles in silk and velvet pressed backward against marble pillars, while the man they called the Wolf of Ravenwyck crossed the polished floor alone. His boots struck stone with the rhythm of a funeral march. Behind him, 3 lords lay bleeding in the snow outside the palace gates, their challenge to his authority answered with steel and contempt. Caedric had not bothered cleaning his blade before entering the emperor's presence. The message was clear. Power did not apologize for what it took to maintain itself. This is a story about what happens when control becomes the only language a man remembers how to speak, and the woman who refused to be translated. Stay with me through the darkness ahead. Something crucial breaks in the final moments, and you will want to see exactly how it shatters. The Winter Kingdom of Valdoria existed in the shadow of one man's rage, though few would dare name it so plainly. Duke Caedric Valagrave controlled the northern territories with precision that made clockwork look clumsy, and his reputation reached far beyond the frost-covered borders of his duchy. Men spoke his name quietly in taverns. Women warned their daughters about catching his attention. The imperial court treated him like a necessary weapon, useful, deadly, and best kept at arm's length until violence became politically convenient. Ravenwyck Castle rose from black cliffs like something carved by winter itself, all sharp angles and unforgiving stone. Caedric stood in the war room on the castle's highest floor, staring at maps spread across oak tables while late afternoon light bled through narrow windows. His steward, Greaves, stood near the doorway with documents requiring signatures. The old man had served the Valagrave family for 40 years and knew better than to interrupt when his master was thinking. "How long do you wait?" Greaves wondered silently, before silence becomes its own form of violence. Caedric traced the border of his territory with one scarred finger. The emperor wanted him to accept a political marriage. The letter had arrived 3 days ago with imperial seals thick as armor plating, and Caedric had read it exactly once before throwing it into the fireplace. But the empire did not make requests. It made demands dressed in diplomatic language, and refusal meant treason. Marry the Arden girl, bind the houses, restore peace after her father's betrayal. His jaw tightened until the muscle jumped beneath his skin. Thomas Arden had destroyed the Valagrave family 20 years ago with calculated lies that sent Caedric's father to the executioner's block and scattered his siblings into poverty and exile. Caedric had been 13 years old when imperial guards dragged his father from Ravenwyck in chains. He remembered every detail with the clarity of trauma, the sound of his mother's screaming, the weight of his younger sister clinging to his legs, the way snow had fallen on the courtyard like ash from a funeral pyre. It took him 15 years to claw his way back to power, 15 years of blood, manipulation, and ruthless ambition. He rebuilt the Valagrave name one broken enemy at a time, and by the age of 28, he ruled the north with authority that made other nobles look like children playing at governance. And now the emperor wanted him to marry Thomas Arden's daughter. Greaves finally cleared his throat. "Your Grace, the imperial envoy will arrive tomorrow morning. They expect an answer, Shikshis." "They'll get one," Caedric said without looking up from the maps. "May I ask what answer you intend to give?" Caedric turned slowly, and Greaves saw something in his master's eyes that made 40 years of service feel inadequate preparation for this moment. There was calculation there, cold and patient as winter itself. "I intend to give them exactly what they asked for." The betrothal ceremony took place in the Grand Cathedral of Valdres under vaulted ceilings that made even shouting feel small. Seraphina Arden knelt on cold marble before the high priest, while 200 witnesses watched from carved pews. She wore mourning black rather than bridal white, and nobody commented on the choice. Her father had died in a traitor's prison 3 months ago, his name stripped from imperial records, his estate seized by the crown. She was 23 years old, entirely alone, and absolutely certain this marriage was her execution dressed in ceremony. She had not met Duke Caedric Valagrave before today. The imperial guards who escorted her north from the capital spoke about him in fragments of incomplete warnings. Ruthless, they said. Unforgiving. Brilliant. Dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with swordplay. One guard mentioned that the Duke had personally killed 4 men in duels over matters of honor, and then added quietly that those were only the deaths witnessed in public. The cathedral doors opened with a sound like thunder. Caedric entered alone, refusing the traditional procession of family and honor guard. He wore black like she did, his formal cloak trimmed with silver that caught the light from 1,000 candles. Every step he took toward the altar felt deliberate, measured, designed to make the entire room remember who held power in this space. Seraphina watched him approach and forced herself not to look away. If this man intended to destroy her, she would at least face it with her eyes open. He stopped 3 feet from where she knelt and looked down at her with eyes the color of winter storms. "Stand up," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried through the cathedral like a blade drawn in silence. Seraphina rose slowly, meeting his gaze with something that was not quite defiance, but certainly not submission. They stood face to face while the high priest began reciting the marriage vows in old imperial language that turned commitment into chains. Caedric did not look away from her once during the entire ceremony. It was not romantic, it was predatory. Seraphina felt like something being cataloged for weaknesses, studied for vulnerabilities, assessed for exactly how much pressure it would take to break her completely. When the time came for him to speak his vows, Caedric's voice cut through the cathedral like judgment. "I take Seraphina Arden as my wife before this court and this empire. Her name, her future, her freedom now belong to House Valagrave." The words were traditional. The tone made them sound like a threat. The high priest turned to Seraphina, waiting for her vows. She opened her mouth and heard her own voice emerge steadier than she expected. "I accept this union." 4 words. No promises of obedience, no pledge of devotion, no romantic language about love and honor. Just acceptance of reality. Several nobles in the pews shifted uncomfortably. The high priest frowned but continued the ceremony, declaring them bound before God and empire. Caedric took her hand with fingers that felt like iron wrapped in flesh. His grip was not painful, but it was absolute. He leaned close enough that only she could hear his next words. "Don't mistake this for mercy." Seraphina looked directly into those cold eyes and whispered back, "I mistake it for nothing at all." Something flickered across his face too quickly to identify. Then he turned toward the watching nobles and pulled her forward like a trophy claimed in conquest. The cathedral erupted in polite applause that sounded more like fear than celebration. The wedding feast took place in Ravenwyck's great hall under chandeliers that threw fractured light across long tables laden with food nobody seemed interested in eating. Nobles from across the northern territories sat in careful hierarchy, watching Duke Caedric and his new wife with the focused attention predators give each other before violence begins. Seraphina sat beside him at the high table, feeling the weight of 200 stares measuring her worth and finding it lacking. Lady Cordelia Thornwyck, a duchess whose family controlled the eastern trade routes, raised her wine glass in a toast that dripped with poisoned courtesy. "To the new Duchess of Ravenwyck, may she prove more loyal than her father." The hall went silent. Even the servants stopped moving. Seraphina felt Caedric go rigid beside her, his hand tightening around his goblet until she thought the metal might bend. This was a test, not of him, but of her. The entire court wanted to see if the Duke's new wife would crumble at the first insult. Seraphina turned to face Lady Cordelia with a smile that never reached her eyes. "My father died in chains because powerful people found him inconvenient. I wonder how many others in this room might share that fate if truth ever became fashionable." The temperature in the hall dropped 10 degrees. Lady Cordelia's face went white, then red. Several nobles choked on their wine. Caedric turned his head slowly to look at Seraphina, and she saw something in his expression that might have been surprise if the Duke allowed himself such pedestrian emotions. "Well," Caedric said quietly, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, "it seems my wife has teeth." Lord Ravenscar, an older noble who served as Caedric's master of coin, laughed into his wine. The tension broke slightly, though Seraphina could feel Lady Cordelia's hatred like heat from a forge. She had made an enemy, probably several, but she had also established that she would not be easy prey. Caedric leaned close enough that his breath brushed her ear when he spoke. That was either very brave or very stupid. "Does it matter which?" Seraphina asked without looking at him. "Not yet." The rest of the feast passed in careful theater. Nobles approached the high table to offer congratulations that sounded like threats. Musicians played songs about love and loyalty, while everyone pretended not to notice the irony. Caedric acknowledged each visitor with minimum courtesy, his attention never leaving Seraphina for more than a few seconds at a time. She felt like something being guarded rather than honored. When the feast finally ended and the last nobles departed into the winter night, Caedric stood and offered his hand. "Come with me." It was not a request. Seraphina placed her hand in his and let him lead her from the great hall through corridors lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. Servants pressed themselves against walls as they passed, eyes lowered in fear or respect, or both. The castle felt enormous and empty at the same time, like a mausoleum built for the living. They stopped at a set of double doors carved with ravens and wolves. Caedric pushed them open to reveal a bedroom 3 times the size of any room Seraphina had ever occupied. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, flames already burning. Windows looked out over the northern mountains, where snow fell in the darkness like pieces of shattered sky. "These are your chambers," Caedric said, releasing her hand. "Mine are through that door." He gestured to a connecting door on the far wall. Seraphina looked at it, then back at him, waiting for whatever came next. Caedric walked to a side table and poured 2 glasses of wine. He offered her one, and she took it more out of reflex than desire. "Your father destroyed my family," Caedric said, his voice flat and emotionless. "My father was executed. My mother died of grief 6 months later. My sister was forced to marry a merchant twice her age to survive. I spent 15 years rebuilding what Thomas Arden tore down with his lies." Seraphina met his gaze. "My father died calling your name. He said he was innocent until his last breath. They all do. Did yours?" The question landed like a knife between them. Caedric's expression did not change, but his hand tightened around his wine glass until the stem creaked under pressure. "You will live in this castle as my wife," Caedric continued as if she had not spoken. "You will attend functions when required. You will present the appropriate image to the court and empire. In return, you will have safety, comfort, and protection from those who would use you against me." "And in private?" Seraphina asked. "In private, you are a debt being repaid." He drank his entire glass of wine in one motion, set it down with deliberate care, and walked to the connecting door. He stopped with his hand on the handle and looked back at her one final time. "Sleep well, Duchess. Tomorrow you begin learning exactly what it costs to carry the Valagrave name." The door closed behind him with a sound like finality. Seraphina stood alone in the massive room, listening to the fire crack and pop in the silence. She did not cry. She did not scream. She walked to the window and looked out at the mountains and the falling snow and the kingdom that had become her prison. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and whispered to her own reflection, "I will survive you, Caedric Valagrave. Whatever you do to me, however long it takes, I will survive you." The mountains did not answer, but Seraphina had not expected them to. Survival never announced itself in advance. It simply happened one impossible day at a time, or it did not happen at all. The first 3 weeks of their marriage established patterns that felt less like coexistence and more like a carefully choreographed war where neither side would acknowledge the fighting had begun. Caedric ruled his duchy with the same ruthless efficiency that made other nobles look like they were governing through guesswork and prayer. He rose before dawn, worked until midnight, and controlled every detail of northern politics with precision that was either impressive or terrifying, depending on whether you benefited from his attention or suffered under it. Seraphina existed in the spaces he did not occupy. She took breakfast alone in her chambers while he met with advisors. She walked the castle grounds while he handled correspondence. She attended court functions on his arm, looking perfect and silent. A trophy wife whose main function was proving Caedric Valagrave could bend even his enemies' children to his will. But when they returned to their private chambers each night, he disappeared through the connecting door without a word, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that this marriage was designed to break her through isolation rather than violence. The castle staff treated her like glass that might shatter if addressed directly. Most avoided her entirely. Those who could not avoid her spoke in whispers and half-finished sentences, as if saying her name too loudly might summon the Duke's wrath. Only one person treated her like a human being rather than a political inconvenience. His name was Thomas Greaves, Caedric's steward and the closest thing to an ally Seraphina had found in Ravenwyck's cold halls. She encountered him in the library on her 17th day as Duchess, searching for books that were not military history or philosophical texts about power. Greaves stood near the poetry section, organizing volumes with the care of someone who believed books deserved better treatment than most people received. "Your Grace," he said when he noticed her. "May I help you find something?" Seraphina almost laughed at the absurdity of formal address in an empty library. "I'm looking for anything that might make me forget where I am for an hour or two." Greaves studied her with eyes that had seen 40 years of Valagrave family history and probably understood more about her situation than she did herself. He pulled a slim volume from the shelf and offered it to her. "Try this. The poet died in exile after insulting a duke, but she wrote beautifully about survival in impossible places." Seraphina took the book and read the title, Songs from the Northern Wastes. "Did she survive?" Seraphina asked quietly. "She did. Not comfortably, not easily, but she survived long enough to write 3 more collections and die on her own terms at 86. Something in Greaves' tone suggested he was not just talking about dead poets. Seraphina met his gaze and saw sympathy there, carefully controlled but genuine. "Thank you," she said. "The Duke is not an easy man," Greaves said carefully, glancing toward the library door as if Caedric might materialize from shadows. "But he is not unchangeable. I have known him since he was a boy. There was kindness in him once." "What happened to it?" "The same thing that happens to all soft things in winter. It froze, or it died, or it learned to hide so deep nobody remembers it existed." Greaves bowed slightly and left her alone with the book and the question of whether frozen kindness could ever thaw, or if some cold went too deep for fire to reach. Mike. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon during a council meeting that Seraphina was not supposed to attend but heard anyway because voices carried through Ravenwyck's stone corridors like whispers through cathedral vaults. Lord Ravenscar was arguing about trade negotiations with the southern territories. His voice rose with frustration as he tried to convince Caedric to compromise on tariff rates that would damage northern merchants but appease imperial demands. "We cannot afford to alienate the Emperor over trade disputes," Ravenscar insisted. "The southern lords are already calling you difficult. The imperial court thinks you've grown too powerful, too independent. If we don't show flexibility now, then what?" Caedric's voice cut through the argument like a blade through silk. "They'll send another army north? They'll strip my titles? They'll execute me for the crime of protecting my people from southern greed? Your Grace, I'm simply suggesting..." "You're suggesting I bend. You're suggesting I compromise. You're suggesting I prove I can be controlled because powerful men make weak emperors nervous." Silence fell across the council chamber. Seraphina stood in the corridor outside, hidden in shadows, listening to the Duke she had married demonstrate exactly why people called him dangerous. "I spent 15 years crawling back from nothing," Caedric said, his voice dropping to something quiet and infinitely more frightening than shouting. 15 years watching my family starve and scatter because Thomas Arden whispered lies to an emperor who was too weak to verify truth before ordering executions. I will not compromise with the same system that destroyed everything I loved because political convenience matters more than justice." "But Your Grace, the Emperor has already shown favor by arranging your marriage to the Arden girl." "Don't call her that." The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop. Seraphina pressed closer to the wall, barely breathing. I apologize, Your Grace. I simply meant, I know what you meant. Meeting adjourned." Footsteps approached the door. Seraphina moved quickly, sliding into an alcove as nobles filed out of the council chamber, looking like men who had just survived something dangerous without entirely understanding how. Lord Ravenscar passed so close she could smell expensive cologne and nervous sweat. When the last noble disappeared down the corridor, Seraphina emerged from hiding and found herself face to face with Caedric. He stood in the doorway, still wearing the same cold expression he must have used to end the council meeting, but something flickered in his eyes when he recognized her. "How long were you listening?" he asked. "Long enough? Lessons in governance or preparation for escape?" Seraphina held his gaze. Is there a difference? Caedric studied her for a long moment, and she felt that same predatory assessment she had experienced during their wedding. But this time, something else lived behind it. Curiosity, maybe. Or the beginning of recognition that she was not the fragile thing he expected to break under pressure. "Walk with me," Caedric said. It was still not a request, but the tone had shifted slightly. Seraphina followed him through corridors and down stone staircases until they reached the castle's winter garden, where carefully tended plants grew in defiance of snow piling against glass walls. Caedric stopped near a fountain frozen into crystalline sculpture and turned to face her. "Why did you defend yourself against Lady Cordelia at the feast?" The question caught Seraphina off guard. "Would you have preferred I stayed silent while she insulted me?" Most would have. Most would be wrong. Caedric's mouth twitched in something that might have been the ghost of a smile if he remembered how. "Your father taught you to fight back." My father taught me that silence in the face of cruelty is just slower death. And yet he died silently in a prison cell. Seraphina felt anger rise hot in her chest. He died protecting something. I don't know what, but he refused to bargain his way out even when they offered him clemency for confession. That sounds like a man who knew truth mattered more than survival. "Truth," Caedric repeated, tasting the word like poison. "Truth is whatever the powerful decide it is. Your father's truth died with him. My father's truth died on an executioner's block. We are living in the empire built on convenient lies, and you think defending yourself at dinner parties changes anything?" "I think staying silent changes nothing," Seraphina said quietly. "And I think you believe the same thing, or you would not have spent 15 years clawing your way back to power." Caedric went very still. For several seconds, the only sound in the winter garden was wind against glass and the distant call of ravens somewhere in the castle towers. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "You are either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most foolish." "Does it matter which?" She threw his own words back at him from their wedding feast. Caedric heard the echo, and something changed in his expression. Not softness, not mercy, but recognition. "Not yet," he said again, "but it will." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the winter garden surrounded by plants that survived despite the cold. Seraphina watched him go and realized something that made her breath catch in her chest. Caedric Valagrave was not a man who had stopped feeling. He was a man who felt everything so deeply that the only way to function was pretending he felt nothing at all. His cruelty was not absence of humanity. It was humanity under so much pressure it had transformed into something harder and sharper and infinitely more dangerous. And somewhere beneath that pressure, something was beginning to crack. The shift was subtle at first. Small changes that might have meant nothing or might have meant everything, depending on whether you believed Duke Caedric Valagrave was capable of change at all. He started joining her for breakfast twice a week. They did not speak much, but the silence became less hostile and more simply present. Caedric read correspondence while she read poetry, and occasionally he would glance up from military reports to find her watching him. He never asked what she was thinking. She never volunteered the information. He stopped disappearing immediately after court functions. Instead, he would walk her back to their chambers and linger in the doorway between their rooms, neither entering nor fully leaving, as if testing boundaries that had been established without discussion. Once, late at night, Seraphina heard sounds from his room that made her stop mid-step. Not violence. Worse. The harsh, quiet sounds of someone trying very hard not to be heard breaking down. She stood with her hand on the connecting door for 10 full minutes, debating whether opening it would be kindness or cruelty. In the end, she stepped away and let him keep his privacy, understanding that some pain people need to survive alone. The court noticed. Rumors spread with the efficiency of well-oiled gossip machines. The Duke's hand lingered too long at his wife's waist. The Duke's voice softened when addressing her. The Duke killed a minor noble in a duel after the man drunkenly suggested Duchess Seraphina looked lonely and might benefit from outside companionship. That last incident sent shockwaves through Ravenwyck. The duel took place in the castle courtyard at dawn, with half the court watching. The fight lasted exactly 40 seconds. Caedric moved like violence given human form, his blade opening the other man's throat, before most witnesses understood the duel had truly begun. Seraphina watched from her chamber window, feeling sick and angry and something else she could not identify. When Caedric returned to their chambers 2 hours later, she was waiting. "You killed him," she said. "Yes." "Because he insulted me." "Yes." "I didn't ask you to kill him." Caedric stood in the doorway between their rooms, still wearing clothes spattered with someone else's blood. His eyes held that cold certainty that made reasonable conversation feel impossible. "He called you a whore purchased with political gold. He said I married your father's sins and deserved whatever shame came with it. I don't care what he said," Seraphina interrupted, surprising herself with the force of her own anger. "I don't care if he called me every cruel name in every language spoken across the empire. You don't own me. My dignity does not belong to you. My honor is not yours to defend with someone else's blood." Caedric crossed the space between them in 3 steps. He stopped close enough that Seraphina had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. This near, she could see the exhaustion there. The weight of violence carried too long. "Then whose blood do you want, Seraphina?" he asked quietly. "Mine?" "Yours." Every insult they whisper behind silk fans and crystal goblets slowly cuts you apart until nothing remains but the ghost of who you were. I've watched it destroy people. I will not watch it destroy you. The admission hung between them like confession. "Why?" Seraphina whispered. "Why do you care, see?" Caedric's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might answer honestly. Then the walls came back up, and he stepped away. "Because you're my wife. Insults against you are insults against me." "Liar." The words stopped him mid-turn. He looked back at her with something dangerous in his expression. "What did you call me?" "A liar. You don't kill men over insults to your property. You kill them when something you actually care about gets threatened." Boom. They stared at each other across 3 feet of space that felt like miles. Caedric's hands flexed at his sides, and Seraphina saw him fighting something internal and violent that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with wars he had been fighting since he was 13 years old. "Get out of my sight," he said finally, his voice rough. "This is my chamber." "Then I'll leave." He turned toward the connecting door, but Seraphina moved faster, stepping between him and escape. Caedric stopped so suddenly they almost collided. This close she could smell blood and winter and something underneath it all that was just him. "What do you want from me, Caedric?" Ishgate. She used his name for the first time since their wedding, and it landed between them like a stone thrown into still water. He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts fury and something painfully close to desperation. "I want," he started, then stopped. "What? Say it." "I want you to stop making me remember who I was before everything burned down." The honesty in his voice made Seraphina's breath catch. Caedric reached up and almost touched her face, his hand stopping inches away as if proximity alone might cause damage. "You walk through this castle like you still believe kindness matters," he continued, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You tend servants in secret. You defend yourself against nobles who could destroy you with rumors. You look at me like I'm still capable of being human, and every time you do, I remember being 13 years old and believing the world was fair and good people were protected, and justice actually existed." "Maybe it does," Seraphina said softly. "It doesn't. I've lived long enough to know truth dies every time it becomes inconvenient to power." "Then why are you still fighting?" The question hit something deep. Caedric's hand finally dropped, and he stepped back, putting distance between them like armor. "Because 15 years ago I promised my dying mother I would restore our name. Because my sister deserves better than the life she's living. Because every noble who bowed to Thomas Arden's lies and let my family burn deserves to spend the rest of their lives afraid of the boy they helped destroy." "Revenge," Seraphina said. "Justice. There's a difference. Not when you're the one who lost everything." Oh. Caedric turned and walked through the connecting door before she could respond, closing it behind him with careful control that was somehow worse than slamming. Seraphina stood alone in her chamber, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat and the distant cry of ravens in castle towers. Something between them had shifted. Not toward reconciliation, not toward understanding, but toward something raw and honest that was both dangerous and necessary. Like surgery, painful in the moment, but required if anything was going to heal. She pressed her hand against the connecting door and whispered to wood and silence. What if your justice is built on lies too? Bayatra Masam. The door did not answer, but somewhere deep in Ravenwyck Castle, buried beneath decades of imperial archives and deliberately forgotten records, truth waited like a blade hidden in darkness. And when Seraphina finally found it, 3 weeks later, everything would shatter. But that discovery still lived in the future. For now, she stood at the threshold between two rooms, two lives, two people who were either destroying each other or saving each other, or both at the same time. Outside the window, snow continued falling on the kingdom of Valdoria, where power ruled through fear and broken boys became dangerous men, and truth died quietly in prison cells, unless someone was brave enough or foolish enough to go searching for it in the dark. The Imperial Archives existed 3 levels beneath Ravenwyck Castle, in chambers carved from living rock during wars nobody alive remembered fighting. Most nobles forgot the archives existed at all, which suited Seraphina perfectly as she descended stone stairs by candlelight at 2 in the morning. Sleep had become a luxury she could not afford, not when questions about her father's treason kept circling through her mind like carrion birds waiting for something to die. The archive doors were unlocked, which told her either nobody considered old records worth protecting, or Caedric wanted her to find whatever truth lived down here. She was not certain which possibility disturbed her more. Dust covered everything in layers thick enough to track footprints. Seraphina moved between shelves stacked with leather-bound volumes and wooden crates marked with imperial seals from decades past. The candlelight threw shadows that danced across spines embossed with years: 1784, 1791, 1803. She was looking for 1806, the year her father was arrested and Caedric's father was executed, and 2 families burned down together while the Empire watched. She found the section marked with that cursed year tucked in a corner behind military supply records nobody would ever read. 3 wooden crates sat stacked against the wall, their lids sealed with wax that had cracked with age. Seraphina set her candle down and pried the first crate open with hands that shook slightly despite her best efforts at control. Papers. Hundreds of them. Court transcripts, witness testimonies, correspondence between imperial officials. She spread them across the stone floor and began reading by flickering light, searching for the story beneath the story everyone believed they knew. 2 hours later, her candle had burned halfway down, and her entire understanding of reality had collapsed like a building with its foundations removed. The treason charges against her father were built on testimony from 5 witnesses who all reported the same details in language so identical it could not have been coincidence. Thomas Arden met with foreign agents. Thomas Arden accepted gold to betray imperial military positions. Thomas Arden orchestrated the death of Duke Edmund Valagrave to cover his crimes. But tucked between official testimonies, Seraphina found something else. Letters marked with seals she recognized from Ravenwyck's own correspondence. Letters written in a woman's handwriting. Letters signed with the name Vesper Valagrave, Edmund's sister and Caedric's aunt. The letters were instructions. Precise, detailed instructions on exactly what each witness should say, how they should say it, when they should come forward with their testimony. And woven through every carefully crafted lie was the same promise. Cooperation would be rewarded. Resistance would be fatal. Vesper had framed Thomas Arden, not for treason against the Empire, but for discovering her own crimes. And when Thomas refused to stay silent about what he had found, Vesper manufactured evidence that destroyed him and used his downfall to eliminate Edmund Valagrave, the only person who might have stopped her from consolidating power within the family. Seraphina's hands trembled as she held letters written 20 years ago by a woman who still lived in Ravenwyck's East Wing, still advised Caedric on matters of family and duchy politics, still smiled at court functions while the ghosts of 2 dead men haunted the halls around her. Footsteps echoed down the corridor outside the archives. Seraphina's heart slammed against her ribs. She grabbed the letters and shoved them inside her dress, then scrambled to return the other papers to their crate. The footsteps grew closer. She managed to close the crate lid and push it back against the wall seconds before the archive doors opened. Thomas Greaves stood in the doorway holding a lantern, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he understood exactly what he had interrupted. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "it is past 3 in the morning. Seraphina straightened, trying to control her breathing and the guilty terror that must have been written across her face. I could not sleep. Few people can in this castle. Greaves stepped into the archives and closed the door behind him with deliberate care. The question is whether insomnia leads you toward truth or away from it. The words hung between them like a test. Seraphina studied the old steward in the lantern light and made a decision that might save her life or end it. My father was innocent. Greaves did not look surprised. He set the lantern on a nearby shelf and met her gaze with eyes that had witnessed too much history to pretend shock at one more revelation. Yes, he said simply. I have always suspected so. Then why did no one speak? Why did everyone let him die? Because the alternative was dying themselves. Greaves moved closer, keeping his voice low despite the empty corridors outside. Your father discovered financial crimes that reached into the highest levels of imperial government. He brought his evidence to Duke Edmund, believing the Valagraves were powerful enough to protect him and force an investigation. But Edmund's sister Vesper had already positioned herself carefully. She could not allow the investigation to proceed without exposing her own involvement, so she killed them both. She destroyed them both. There is a difference. Death would have been mercy compared to what she did. She turned Edmund's son into a weapon aimed at your family. She spent 20 years feeding Caedric lies about your father, while she quietly stole wealth from duchy accounts and bribed imperial officials to look the other way. Why are you telling me this? Seraphina asked. Why help me now? Because I watched Caedric grow from a grieving boy into a dangerous man, and I have spent 20 years praying someone would finally show him the truth before it turned him into something irredeemable. Greaves paused, weighing his next words carefully. He is not kind. He is not gentle. But he is not beyond saving. Not yet. The letters in Seraphina's dress felt like they were burning through fabric and skin. She pulled them out and held them toward Greaves. I need to show him these. Greaves looked at the papers like they were serpents coiled to strike. If you do, everything changes. The Duchess Vesper will retaliate. The court will fracture. Caedric will have to choose between the aunt who raised him after his parents died and a wife he married to punish her father's memory. Are you prepared for that choice? Seraphina thought about her father dying in chains, calling her name until his last breath. She thought about Caedric carrying 15 years of misdirected rage like a second skeleton underneath his skin. She thought about truth and lies and the empire built on convenient fictions that destroyed real people with real grief. I am prepared for him to know the truth. Whatever comes after is his choice. Greaves nodded slowly, acceptance and respect mixing in his expression. Then may whatever gods exist protect you both. Because Vesper Valagrave does not lose power gracefully, and Caedric does not forgive betrayal even when it comes from blood. He turned and left the archives, taking his lantern and leaving Seraphina alone with stolen letters and the certainty that she was about to detonate something that would either destroy the duchy or save it, and possibly both at once. She climbed the stairs back to her chambers as dawn began bleeding gray light through narrow windows. Her body moved through exhaustion, running on pure determination and the knowledge that some truths could not wait for convenient timing. Convenient timing never came. It had to be forced into existence through action that looked like recklessness from the outside but felt like survival from within. She did not go to her chambers. She went directly to Caedric's door and knocked hard enough that the sound echoed through the corridor. No answer. She knocked again, harder. The door opened so suddenly she almost fell forward. Caedric stood in the doorway wearing only sleep pants, his hair disheveled and his expression moving from confusion to irritation to concern in the span of 3 seconds. What happened? He said. It was not a question. Seraphina pushed past him into his chambers and turned to face him with the letters clutched in both hands. I need you to read something, right now, before I lose my courage or you convince yourself this is manipulation. Caedric closed the door and moved toward her with the careful attention of someone approaching a wounded animal that might bite. Seraphina, it is barely dawn. Whatever you found can wait until... My father was innocent. The words stopped him mid-step. His entire body went rigid, and something moved behind his eyes that was either fury or fear or the intersection of both. Your father confessed to treason, Caedric said, his voice dropping into dangerous quiet. He confessed in front of imperial magistrates. The evidence was overwhelming. The evidence was manufactured. Seraphina held out the letters with hands that no longer shook because she had moved past fear into that strange clarity that comes when you realize there is no path forward except through. Read them. They are correspondence between your Aunt Vesper and the witnesses who testified against my father. She paid them. She coached them. She framed him to cover her own crimes. Caedric stared at the letters like they might burst into flames. Where did you find these? The Imperial Archives, 3 levels down. Nobody has touched those records in decades. And you just happened to go searching. I went searching because I needed to know why my father died calling your name. I needed to know if there was any truth beneath the lies everyone accepted. Seraphina stepped closer, forcing him to either retreat or hold his ground. And what I found is that both our fathers were destroyed by the same woman. The woman who has advised you for 20 years. The woman who rebuilt you into exactly the weapon she needed to maintain control. Caedric took the letters with movements that looked mechanical, forced. He carried them to the window where dawn light was growing stronger and began reading. Seraphina watched his face for reaction and saw nothing except absolute control. But his hands tightened on the papers until they crumpled slightly at the edges, and his breathing changed rhythm in ways that meant whatever he was reading was destroying something fundamental inside him. He read all 7 letters without speaking. When he finished, he stood motionless for so long, Seraphina started to wonder if he was still breathing. This could be forgery, he said finally, not looking at her. It is not. You have every reason to lie to me, and you have every reason not to believe me. Seraphina moved to stand beside him, both of them staring out at the mountains beyond the castle walls. But that does not change what is written there in your aunt's handwriting on paper sealed with Valagrave marks. Your father was murdered. My father was murdered. And we have spent our entire marriage hating each other for crimes neither of us committed. Caedric's jaw worked silently. His hands gripped the letters hard enough that Seraphina heard paper tearing. If what you are saying is true, he said slowly, carefully, as if testing each word for structural integrity, then everything I have built is founded on lies. Every decision, every enemy I made, every person I destroyed for my family's honor, all of it based on false history manufactured by someone I trusted. Yes. The single word hung between them like a blade suspended by thread. Caedric turned to face her fully, and Seraphina saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not anger, not denial, but recognition. The terrible recognition of someone who has just realized the shape of their entire life is wrong, and changing it means tearing down everything they built and starting over from ruins. Show me where you found them, he said. Show me everything in those archives, and then we are going to have a conversation with my aunt. I'm set. The sun had fully risen by the time Caedric finished reading every document in the crates marked 1806. He sat on the archive floor surrounded by papers, his back against cold stone, looking like someone who had just survived a battle by losing everything that mattered. Seraphina sat across from him, watching him process 20 years of misdirected rage, collapsing into something more dangerous, clarity. My father wrote to the Emperor 3 times requesting an investigation, Caedric said, his voice flat and emotionless. The letters were intercepted. Vesper showed them to me years later as evidence of his instability. She said he was paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere, losing his grip on reality. She was protecting herself, Seraphina said quietly. She was using me. Caedric looked up, and his eyes held something that might have been grief if he allowed himself such vulnerable emotions. I have spent 15 years becoming exactly what she needed. A weapon aimed at anyone who might threaten her position. I killed men in duels over my family's honor. I crushed rebellion before it started. I married you to prove the Valagrave name could break even the children of our enemies. He stopped, his throat working around words that did not want to be spoken. And all of it, every single piece of it, was designed to keep me focused on external enemies while she stole from duchy accounts and consolidated power around herself. What are you going to do? Seraphina asked. Caedric stood slowly, his movements controlled but containing something volatile underneath. He brushed dust from his clothes with deliberate care, and Seraphina recognized it as the same careful control he used before violence began. I am going to give Vesper exactly 1 chance to confess. If she takes it, she leaves the duchy quietly and never returns. If she does not take it, I will destroy her the way she destroyed our families. And if she retaliates, Then the Empire learns what happens when you turn a grieving boy into a weapon and lose control of where he aims. The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, which made them infinitely more frightening than threats shouted in anger. Seraphina stood and faced him across scattered papers and broken history. I am coming with you. No. Caedric, she is responsible for my father's death as much as yours. I have a right to face her. You have a right to safety. Caedric moved closer, and for the first time since their wedding, he touched her face deliberately, his hand rough with calluses but surprisingly gentle. Vesper will come after you first because you are the one who found the evidence. She will use every weapon she has, and I need to know you are protected while I dismantle her power piece by piece. I do not need your protection. I know. Caedric's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and Seraphina felt her breath catch at the intimacy of the gesture. But I'm asking you to accept it anyway, not because you are weak, but because if something happened to you while I was destroying the person who killed our fathers, I would burn this entire empire down. And I'm trying very hard not to become that person. The admission hung between them with the weight of confession. Seraphina searched his face and saw exhaustion there, and grief, and something that looked terrifyingly like the beginning of actual feeling, breaking through 2 decades of carefully maintained emotional permafrost. Promise me you will not face her alone, Seraphina said. I will bring guards and witnesses. Vesper's power comes from operating in shadows. If I force everything into daylight, she loses the only advantage she has. When? Now. Before she realizes what we have found. Caedric gathered the letters and walked toward the archive doors. He stopped with his hand on the handle and looked back at Seraphina with an expression she could not entirely read. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For being brave enough to search for truth, even when everyone, including me, wanted you to accept comfortable lies. For surviving 3 weeks in this castle, surrounded by people who hated you for crimes you did not commit. For not breaking when I tried very hard to make you break. His voice was rough with something that might have been regret or gratitude or both tangled together. I married you to punish your father's memory, he continued. But you are not your father. And I am beginning to understand that I am not the weapon Vesper created either. Or I do not have to be if I choose differently. We could both choose differently, Seraphina said softly. Could we? The question was genuine, vulnerable in a way Caedric's voice rarely allowed. Seraphina crossed the space between them and took his free hand, feeling the tension in his fingers. I think we already have. Everything after this moment is just seeing if we are strong enough to survive the consequences. Caedric looked at their joined hands like he was trying to solve an equation that defied mathematics. Then he squeezed once, brief and firm, before releasing her and opening the door. Stay in your chambers until I send word. And Seraphina, if anything feels wrong, if anyone approaches you who should not, scream loud enough that the entire castle hears. Do not be polite. Do not be diplomatic. Survival matters more than manners. He left before she could respond, moving through corridors with purpose that made servants press themselves against walls. Seraphina watched him go and felt her heart hammering against her ribs with fear and something else she was not ready to name. She climbed back to her chambers as the castle woke around her. Servants bustled through hallways preparing for the day. Nobles began gathering for breakfast in the great hall. Everything looked normal, ordinary, safe. But beneath that surface normalcy, something fundamental had shifted. Truth had entered a system built on lies, and systems built on lies did not collapse quietly. They imploded with violence, taking everyone nearby down into the wreckage. Seraphina locked her chamber door and sat by the window, watching snow fall on mountains that had witnessed centuries of human drama and remained unmoved by any of it. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and whispered to her reflection, "Survive this. Whatever happens in the next few hours, just survive." The mountains did not answer. But somewhere else in Ravenwyck Castle, Caedric Valagrave was walking into his aunt's chambers with evidence of her crimes, and the focused rage of someone who had just discovered his entire identity was built on manufactured lies. And Vesper Valagrave, the woman who had orchestrated 2 decades of carefully maintained deception, was about to learn what happened when weapons remembered they could choose their own targets. The confrontation took place in Vesper's private study, a room decorated with enough wealth and taste to make most nobles feel inadequate. She sat behind an antique desk imported from southern kingdoms, reading correspondence with reading glasses perched on her nose. looking like someone's harmless aristocratic aunt rather than the architect of multiple murders. She glanced up when Caedric entered without knocking, her expression shifting from surprise to carefully controlled neutrality in the space of a heartbeat. "Darling nephew," she said, setting down her papers. "This is unexpected. Is something wrong?" Caedric closed the door behind him and placed the letters on her desk with deliberate care. 4 guards stood in the corridor outside, witnesses to whatever happened next. He had kept his promise to Seraphina about not facing this alone, even if alone still meant him doing all the talking while armed men waited nearby. Vesper looked at the letters without touching them. Her face remained perfectly composed, but something flickered in her eyes that told Caedric she knew exactly what those papers contained. "Where did you find those?" she asked calmly. "Imperial Archives. Sealed records from 1806. Correspondence between you and witnesses who testified against Thomas Arden." Vesper removed her reading glasses with movements that seemed almost leisurely. "I see. And you believe these papers are authentic?" "I believe they are written in your handwriting on paper bearing Valagrave seals. I believe they contain instructions on exactly what testimony to provide and promises of payment for cooperation. I believe they prove you framed Thomas Arden to cover your own crimes and used his destruction to eliminate my father when he became inconvenient." The temperature in the room dropped despite the fire burning in the hearth. Vesper stood slowly, moving around her desk to face Caedric directly. "Your father was weak," she said, her voice still maddeningly calm. "He would have allowed Imperial investigators to tear through duchy finances, looking for crimes that did not exist. Thomas Arden was a zealot who saw corruption everywhere and would have destroyed our family's reputation chasing shadows. I protected the Valagrave name when no one else would. You murdered my father. I saved our family from his incompetence." Vesper's composure cracked slightly, showing the steel underneath. Edmund was going to cooperate with Arden's investigation. He was going to open our accounts, our correspondence, everything, to Imperial scrutiny. Do you understand what that would have meant? The Valagrave name would have been dragged through public humiliation while investigators found nothing, because there was nothing to find except normal business arrangements that looked suspicious to paranoid men. "Normal business arrangements," Caedric repeated, his voice dropping into dangerous quiet. "You embezzled duchy funds. You bribed imperial officials. You sold military intelligence to foreign agents for gold. That is not normal business. That is treason. That is survival in an empire that devours the weak." Vesper stepped closer, her eyes hard and unafraid. "I rebuilt this family after your father's weakness nearly destroyed it. I raised you. I taught you how to rule. I made you into the weapon this duchy needed to survive. You made me into your weapon aimed at anyone who threatened your crimes. I made you into a duke who commands respect and fear from every noble in the northern territories." Vesper's voice rose slightly, control slipping. "You were a grieving boy who would have spent his life crying over your father's grave. I gave you purpose. I gave you power. I gave you everything you needed to become the man you are." "The man I am," Caedric said slowly, "is someone who spent 15 years hating an innocent man's daughter for crimes she never committed. The man I am destroyed people based on lies you fed me since childhood. The man I am married a woman specifically to punish her for her father's betrayal. And it turns out her father's only crime was trying to protect mine from you." His voice was still quiet, but something underneath it made Vesper take an involuntary step backward. "So tell me, Aunt Vesper, exactly what did you give me except 15 years of misdirected rage and a marriage built on false history?" Vesper's mask finally dropped completely, showing the cold calculation underneath. "I gave you the opportunity to matter. Without me, you would be nothing. A forgotten name in imperial records, a duke's son who died in poverty and obscurity. You owe me everything, Caedric, and if you think some dusty letters change that debt, you are even more foolish than your father." Caedric smiled, and it was the most frightening expression Vesper had ever seen on his face. "You are right about one thing. I do owe you. I owe you exactly what you gave my father. Exposure, humiliation, justice delivered publicly before the entire court. You would not dare. Watch me." Caedric turned toward the door, then stopped and looked back at his aunt with eyes that carried no mercy whatsoever. "You have until sunset to leave Ravenwyck voluntarily. Take what you can carry and disappear beyond imperial borders. If you are still in this castle when darkness falls, I will arrest you myself and drag you before the Emperor in chains with evidence of every crime you have committed for 20 years. Vesper's hands clenched into fists at her sides. If you do this, every noble in the Northern Territories will question your judgment. They will wonder if you can be trusted. They will see weakness where they once saw strength. Let them wonder. Caedric opened the door and spoke loud enough that the guards in the corridor could hear clearly. I spent 15 years building power on foundations of lies. If burning those foundations down costs me everything I built, then at least I will finally be standing on something real. He walked out, leaving Vesper alone in her study, surrounded by wealth purchased with blood and lies and the crumbling remnants of 2 decades of careful manipulation. What? Seraphina heard the knock on her chamber door 3 hours later and opened it to find Caedric standing in the corridor looking like someone who had just survived a battle by winning and losing. Simultaneously, his face was carved from exhaustion and something that might have been relief or grief, or both mixed together into an emotion without a clean name. "It is done," he said simply. She let him? She cursed me in languages I did not know she spoke, and promised I would regret this for whatever remained of my short, foolish life. Then she called for her carriage and packed. She left an hour ago with enough gold to live comfortably anywhere in the world, except here. And the evidence? Already sent to the Emperor with my personal testimony. By tomorrow, the entire imperial court will know the truth about what happened in 1806. Our fathers will be posthumously cleared. Your family name will be restored. He delivered the news with the flat effect of someone reporting weather, rather than announcing the systematic destruction of his aunt's legacy and the restoration of both their family honors. Seraphina stepped aside, silently inviting him into her chambers. Caedric entered and moved immediately to the window, staring out at the landscape the same way she had spent weeks staring at it, looking for something solid in a world that kept shifting. "I killed 3 men in duels defending my father's honor," Caedric said to the window. "I crushed 2 minor rebellions. I married you specifically to punish your father through you. All of it based on lies she fed me when I was too young and too grief-stricken to question the narrative she created." "You were 13, Seraphina said quietly. "You trusted the only family you had left. Trust is not an excuse for the things I did." Caedric turned to face her, and his eyes held something raw and painful. "I hurt you, deliberately. I married you intending to destroy whatever remained of your spirit. And even after I started to care, I continued hurting you because admitting I cared felt like betraying everything I built my identity around." "Do you?" Seraphina asked. "Care?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Caedric crossed the room in 3 steps and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. This near, she could see the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the gray already threading through dark hair despite being only 28, the weight of 15 years carried in his posture. "I care so much it terrifies me," he said, his voice rough. "I care enough that when Lord Brennan insulted you at the feast, I killed him not to protect my honor, but because hearing him call you a whore made me want to burn the entire castle down. I care enough that I have started waking up at night checking to make sure you are still breathing in the next room. I care enough that finding out my entire war against your family was built on lies felt less like betrayal, and more like being given permission to finally stop fighting." His hands came up to frame her face, and Seraphina felt her breath catch at the gentleness of the gesture from a man who specialized in violence. "I do not know how to do this," Caedric continued. "I do not know how to be a husband rather than a weapon. I do not know how to build something instead of destroying everything that threatens me. But I want to learn. If you are willing to teach me. If I have not destroyed any possibility of that already." Seraphina reached up and placed her hands over his, feeling the tension in his fingers and the slight tremor that meant this admission cost him more than fighting duels or facing down his aunt. "I do not need you to be perfect," she said softly. "I need you to choose truth over comfortable lies. I need you to see me as a person rather than a symbol of your father's betrayal. I need you to understand that I am as damaged and difficult as you are, and building something real means accepting we are both going to hurt each other sometimes without meaning to. Can you forgive what I have already done?" The question was asked with the vulnerability of someone who genuinely did not know the answer and was terrified of hearing it. "I can forgive actions taken under false information," Seraphina said carefully. "I cannot forget them. Some wounds scar even after they heal, but scars do not mean endings. Sometimes they just mean we survived something that should have killed us." Caedric's thumb brushed across her cheekbone in the same gesture he had used in the archives, and this time Seraphina leaned into it rather than pulling away. "I want to survive this with you," he said, I want to build something real out of the ruins Vesper left behind. I want to be the kind of man who deserves the faith you showed by searching for truth when everyone else accepted lies. Then start, Seraphina said. Right now, choose to be that person. Caedric kissed her then, and it was nothing like their wedding kiss performed before 200 witnesses as political theater. This was desperate and honest and tasted like the beginning of something fragile that might grow into something strong if they were careful enough and brave enough to protect it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caedric pressed his forehead against hers and whispered words that sounded like prayer or promise or both. I will spend the rest of my life proving you did not make a mistake by giving me this chance. You do not have to spend your whole life, Seraphina said softly. Just start with tomorrow, and then the day after that. One choice at a time until choosing differently becomes natural. They stood together in the fading afternoon light, while outside the window, snow continued falling on Ravenwyck Castle and the northern territories beyond. Somewhere in the East Wing, servants were already spreading word that Duchess Vesper had left suddenly. By tomorrow, rumors would explode across the duchy. By next week, the entire imperial court would know the truth about 1806. But in this moment, in this room, two people who had been weapons aimed at each other by someone else's malice were choosing to lower their blades and see if the space between them could hold something besides violence. It was not redemption. Redemption required more than one decision made in the aftermath of revelation. But it was the beginning of the possibility of redemption, which was sometimes all anyone broken by lies could hope to build from the ruins left behind. Outside, darkness was falling over Valdoria, and inside Ravenwyck Castle, Duke Caedric Valagrave and his wife stood at the edge of something that might be catastrophe or salvation, or both woven together so tightly that separating them was impossible. The point of no return had been crossed the moment Seraphina found those letters in the archives. Everything after this moment was consequence, some of it beautiful and some of it terrible, and all of it entirely inescapable. Tomorrow they would face the Empire's reaction to their revelations. Tomorrow nobles would question Caedric's judgment and whisper about instability in the northern territories. Tomorrow Vesper would begin plotting her revenge from whatever foreign sanctuary she found. But tonight, they had truth in each other and the fragile possibility that weapons could choose to become something gentler without losing the strength that kept them alive in a world that devoured the weak. Whether that possibility could survive what came next was anyone's guess. But Caedric pulled Seraphina closer and made a silent promise to himself that whatever battles lay ahead, he would face them beside her rather than against her. And that alone was revolutionary enough to change the entire trajectory of how this story might end. Dawn broke over Ravenwyck Castle with the pale gray light that made winter look like the world had forgotten color existed. Caedric woke to find Seraphina still sleeping beside him, her dark hair spread across pillows in his chambers where she had stayed through the night. Not from passion or romance, but from the exhausted collapse of two people who had finally stopped fighting each other long enough to realize they were both running on fumes and determination. He studied her face in the early light and felt something in his chest tighten with an emotion he was still learning to name. Fear, maybe. The terror of having something worth losing after spending 15 years making sure he cared about nothing that could be taken from him. The knock on his chamber door came hard and urgent, the kind of knocking that meant emergency rather than morning routine. Caedric extracted himself carefully from the bed without waking Seraphina and pulled on a robe before opening the door to find Thomas Greaves standing in the corridor with an expression that made every instinct Caedric possessed scream warnings. "Your Grace," Greaves said quietly, "the Imperial courier arrived an hour ago. The Emperor has responded to your testimony about Duchess Vesper." Caedric's stomach dropped. He stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind him, keeping his voice low. "Already? I sent the evidence yesterday afternoon. How did the Emperor respond so quickly?" "Because he did not need to investigate," Greaves said, and the old steward's voice carried something that sounded like pity. "He already knew. Your Grace, I think you should read the letter in private before making any decisions." He handed Caedric a sealed envelope bearing the imperial crest. Caedric took it with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will and broke the seal. The letter inside was brief, written in the Emperor's own hand, which meant whatever it contained was too sensitive for secretaries or official channels. "Duke Valagrave, your testimony regarding Vesper Valagrave's crimes has been received and reviewed. While we appreciate your dedication to truth and justice, we must inform you that this matter is far more complex than you understand. Duchess Vesper has operated with imperial knowledge and approval for 2 decades. The financial arrangements you discovered were authorized intelligence operations designed to maintain stability in the Northern Territories during politically volatile periods. The testimony against Thomas Arden, while regrettable in its necessity, protected crucial imperial interests that superseded individual justice. Your aunt's exile was premature and unauthorized. We expect her return to Ravenwyck within the week under imperial protection. Any attempt to interfere with her return or continue pursuing charges against her will be considered treason against the crown. We suggest you reconsider your recent marriage and the reliability of information provided by those with personal motivations to destabilize your judgment. His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Marcus Valentine III. Caedric read the letter 3 times, each reading making the words worse instead of better. His hands began to shake before he could stop them, rage and disbelief warring for dominance in his chest. He knew, Caedric said, his voice coming out strangled. The Emperor knew everything Vesper did and authorized it. My father died protecting the Empire from crimes the Emperor himself approved. Greaves nodded slowly, his face grave. It is worse than that, Your Grace. If Vesper returns under Imperial protection, she returns with the full authority of the crown behind her. She will have legal justification for everything she did, and anyone who opposes her will be opposing the Emperor directly. Which means the evidence I sent proves nothing, except that I am dangerously naive, and Seraphina is the daughter of a man who died fighting imperial policy the Emperor wanted hidden. Greaves said nothing, which was answer enough. Caedric stood in the corridor holding the letter that destroyed everything he thought he had accomplished in the past 24 hours. The truth was supposed to set them free. Instead, it had revealed that truth meant nothing when power decided lies were more convenient, and the entire imperial system was built to protect the people who manufactured those lies. Behind him, the chamber door opened. Seraphina stepped into the corridor wrapped in one of his cloaks, her hair still disheveled from sleep, her expression moving from soft to concerned as she registered the tension radiating from both men. "What happened?" she asked. Caedric turned to face her and saw the exact moment she understood something had gone catastrophically wrong. Her face went pale, but she straightened her spine and waited for whatever blow was coming. "The Emperor responded to my testimony," Caedric said, his voice flat and emotionless because emotion right now would break him completely. "He authorized everything Vesper did. My aunt was operating as an imperial agent. My father died opposing sanctioned imperial policy. Your father died because he discovered crimes the Emperor needed hidden." He handed her the letter. Seraphina read it with the same growing horror Caedric had experienced, her hands beginning to tremble before she finished. "They are bringing her back," Seraphina whispered, "under protection, with authority to continue everything she was doing before." "Yes. And if we oppose her?" "Treason, execution. The complete destruction of everything I rebuilt over the past 15 years. Seraphina looked up from the letter with eyes that held betrayal and fury, and the dawning realization that justice was a fiction told to children who had not yet learned how the world actually worked. "So we just accept this? We let her return? We pretend the past 24 hours never happened?" "I do not know," Caedric said, and the admission felt like defeat. "I do not know what to do when the Emperor himself decides truth is inconvenient." The Imperial courier arrived 3 days later with 20 armed guards and a formal decree restoring Duchess Vesper Valagrave to her position within the duchy. Caedric stood in the great hall flanked by his own guards and watched his aunt enter Ravenwyck Castle like a conquering general returning from war. She looked exactly the same as when she left, except now she moved with the confidence of someone who knew she was untouchable. The Emperor's seal hung from a chain around her neck, visible proof of imperial favor that made every noble in the room bow slightly as she passed. Vesper stopped 3 feet from Caedric and smiled with all the warmth of winter wind across frozen lakes. "Dear nephew," she said loud enough that everyone in the hall could hear clearly, "I appreciate your concern for family honor, but your zeal nearly created an embarrassing diplomatic incident." Fortunately, His Imperial Majesty understands that young dukes sometimes act rashly before considering the larger political implications of their accusations. Caedric said nothing. Every word he wanted to speak would have been treason spoken publicly before witnesses who would report back to the Emperor. So he stood silent and let his aunt perform her victory. "I trust we can move forward from this misunderstanding," Vesper continued, her tone pleasant and utterly poisonous. Your marriage to Lady Seraphina can continue, of course, though I would recommend exercising better judgment regarding whose advice you trust on matters of family history. Her gaze shifted to Seraphina, who stood near the Great Hall entrance, looking like someone watching their own execution. Lady Seraphina, Vesper said with false warmth, how brave of you to search through old records. Though I fear your father's paranoia has passed to his daughter. One must be careful not to see conspiracies where none exist. My father saw crimes the Empire authorized, Seraphina said, her voice steady despite the fury radiating from her posture. That does not make him paranoid. It makes him inconvenient. The hall went silent. Several nobles drew sharp breaths. Even the Imperial guards shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the danger in Seraphina's words, but uncertain whether they should intervene. Vesper's smile never wavered, but something cold and vicious moved behind her eyes. Your father was a traitor who died as all traitors die. You would do well to remember that when speaking publicly about Imperial matters, you do not understand. I understand perfectly, Seraphina said. I understand that justice is whatever serves the Empire's interests. I understand that truth dies whenever it becomes politically inconvenient. I understand that my father and Caedric's father were sacrifices made to protect your crimes and the Emperor who authorized them. Vesper's composure finally cracked. She crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and backhanded Seraphina hard enough that the sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Seraphina's head snapped to the side, but she did not fall. She turned back to face Vesper with blood at the corner of her mouth and absolute defiance in her eyes. Guards, Vesper said coldly. Escort Lady Seraphina to the North Tower. She will remain there under house arrest until she learns appropriate respect for her betters. No, Caedric said. The single word cut through the hall like a blade. Every eye turned to him. Vesper looked at her nephew with an expression that mixed triumph and warning. I am operating under Imperial authority. Nephew, if you interfere with my orders, you are interfering with the Emperor himself. I do not care, Caedric said, and he felt something fundamental shift inside him as he spoke. I will not let you imprison my wife for speaking truth. Then you choose her over your duchy, over your family name, over everything you spent 15 years rebuilding. Yes, Caedric said simply. I do. The hall erupted in whispers. Nobles who had spent years fearing Duke Caedric Valagrave suddenly saw him transformed from weapon into man, and they were not certain which was more dangerous. Vesper studied her nephew with the calculating attention of someone reassessing a threat they thought they had neutralized. Then she turned to the Imperial guards. Arrest them both, she said. Duke Caedric Valagrave is hereby charged with treason against the crown for harboring conspiracy against Imperial interests. Lady Seraphina is charged as co-conspirator. They will be transported to the capital for trial before the Emperor. The Imperial guards moved forward with weapons drawn. Caedric's own guards tensed, waiting for orders from their duke. In that moment, the great hall of Ravenwyck Castle balanced on the edge of violence that would either end in execution or civil war, and nobody present knew which outcome would be worse. Caedric raised one hand, stopping his guards before they could draw weapons. Stand down, he ordered. Do not fight Imperial soldiers. Your Grace, Lord Ravenscar protested from somewhere in the crowd. If you surrender now. I said stand down, Caedric repeated, his voice carrying absolute authority. This fight does not end here. It cannot end here. If we start a war in this hall, everyone in Ravenwyck will burn for my choices. He looked at Seraphina and saw understanding in her eyes. She knew what he was doing. Surrender now to avoid immediate bloodshed. Survive to fight later when the fight could be won without sacrificing everyone who depended on them for protection. Caedric held out his hands for the guards to bind. They did so with efficiency born from years of arresting nobles who thought their titles would protect them from consequences. When they moved to bind Seraphina, Caedric stepped between them. Carefully, he said quietly, and something in his tone made the guards handle her with more gentleness than they had shown him. The journey to the capital took 6 days through winter storms that turned roads into frozen nightmares. Caedric and Seraphina were kept in separate carriages under constant guard, denied contact with each other or anyone from Ravenwyck. Vesper traveled ahead in her own carriage, moving fast to prepare her case before the Emperor while her nephew and his wife endured the slow procession of prisoners being transported to judgment. On the 4th night, they stopped at an Imperial way station where travelers could rest during long journeys. Caedric sat alone in a locked room, staring at walls and trying to formulate a strategy that did not end with both of them executed for treason. The door opened without warning, and Thomas Greaves slipped inside carrying papers and wearing the expression of someone who had just ridden 4 days straight through winter storms without rest. "Your Grace," Greaves said quietly, "I do not have much time before the guards notice I am here." "How did you get past them?" Caedric asked. "By reminding them I am a harmless old man who has served the Valagrave family for 40 years and poses no threat to Imperial authority." Greaves moved closer and kept his voice barely above a whisper. "I have been gathering information since you were arrested. The situation is worse than you know." Caedric laughed bitterly. "How could it possibly be worse? Because Duchess Vesper is not just operating with Imperial authorization. She has been blackmailing the Emperor for 15 years. She knows secrets about Imperial family scandals that would destroy the throne if made public. Your father discovered this and was killed to protect those secrets. Your aunt has used that leverage to do whatever she wanted with complete immunity." "Then we are dead," Caedric said flatly. "If she has that much power over the Emperor himself, there is no winning this fight." "Not directly," Greaves agreed, "but there are factions within the Imperial court who would benefit from Vesper's downfall. Nobles who resent her influence. Council members who fear how much power she has accumulated. If you can make your trial public enough, messy enough, dangerous enough to the stability of the throne, the Emperor might sacrifice Vesper to preserve his own position. And if I cannot, then you and Seraphina die, and Vesper continues operating with impunity until someone stronger finally removes her." Greaves handed Caedric the papers he had been carrying. They were lists of names, nobles and council members who had reasons to oppose Vesper, along with detailed notes about their vulnerabilities and motivations. "Use this information during your trial," Greaves said. "Make the proceedings about more than just your supposed treason. Make them about 2 decades of Imperial corruption and the nobles who have suffered under Vesper's manipulations. Force the Emperor to choose between protecting one woman or protecting his entire court's stability." "This is treason," Caedric said, staring at the papers. "Yes," Greaves agreed calmly, "but you were already charged with treason for telling the truth. At this point, you might as well commit actual treason if it gives you a chance at survival." The old steward moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at his master with something like paternal concern. "Your father was a good man who died because he believed the system would protect truth. Do not make his mistake, Your Grace. The system protects power. If you want to survive, you must become more dangerous to them alive than dead." Greaves left before Caedric could respond, disappearing into the corridor like a ghost. Caedric sat alone with his papers and the growing certainty that survival required transforming from weapon into something else entirely. Not softer, not kinder, but strategic in ways that made violence look like restraint. He had spent 15 years learning how to destroy enemies directly. Now he needed to learn how to destroy them politically, and he had exactly 2 days before his trial began to figure out how. The Imperial Court assembled in the Grand Judgment Hall with all the theatrical efficiency of an execution disguised as justice. 300 nobles filled marble benches rising in tiers around a central floor where the accused would stand. The Emperor sat on a throne elevated above everyone else, wearing ceremonial robes and an expression of benevolent authority that was pure performance for the gathered witnesses. Caedric and Seraphina were brought in separately, their hands bound, their clothes deliberately plain to emphasize their fall from power. They were made to kneel on cold marble, while imperial magistrates read charges that sounded damning when stripped of context. Conspiracy against the crown, disseminating false accusations against imperial agents, attempting to destabilize northern territories through unfounded claims of corruption. Vesper sat among the highest-ranking nobles looking serene and vindicated, exactly what she had planned from the moment Caedric sent his testimony to the Emperor. The Emperor gestured for silence, and 300 voices died immediately. "Duke Caedric Valagrave," he said, his voice echoing through the hall with practiced grandeur. "You stand accused of treason against this empire. How do you answer these charges?" This was the moment. The single chance Caedric had to either save them both or condemn them beyond any hope of rescue. He looked up at the Emperor and made a choice that was either brilliant or suicidal, and possibly both. "I answer that these charges are accurate, Your Imperial Majesty. I did conspire against imperial interests. I did disseminate accusations designed to destabilize the northern territories. I did all of this deliberately and with full knowledge of the consequences. Gasps erupted throughout the hall. Seraphina's head snapped toward him with shock and confusion written across her face. Even Vesper looked momentarily thrown by the admission. The Emperor leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite himself. "You confess to treason?" "I confess to opposing a system built on sanctioned crimes and convenient murders," Caedric said, his voice rising to carry through the hall. "I confess to believing that truth should matter more than political expedience. I confess to thinking that 2 decades of imperial corruption should be exposed rather than protected. And I confess to being naive enough to believe that justice existed anywhere in this empire except as a word spoken to pacify the powerless." The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted over each other. Imperial guards moved forward as if expecting violence to break out. The Emperor raised one hand for silence, and the hall quieted with the reluctant obedience of people who were not certain they wanted to stay silent. "You realize this confession guarantees your execution," the Emperor said. "Yes," Caedric agreed, "but execution is a public affair, and executions require explanations. So before you have me killed, I would like to explain exactly what crimes I opposed and which Imperial agents committed them under your authorization." He pulled the papers Greaves had given him from inside his shirt, where they had been hidden since the way station. Guards moved to confiscate them, but Caedric spoke quickly before they could reach him. "These documents detail 2 decades of embezzlement, bribery, extortion, and murder committed by Duchess Vesper Valagrave with Imperial approval. They include names of nobles who were destroyed when they became inconvenient. They include amounts of gold stolen from duchy accounts and funneled to Imperial projects through illegal channels. They include testimony from witnesses who were paid to commit perjury in official trials." "Stop him," Vesper hissed from her seat. "Let him finish," the Emperor said quietly, and his tone suggested this was not mercy but curiosity about how far Caedric was willing to go. "They also include," Caedric continued, looking directly at the Emperor, "detailed records of blackmail material Duchess Vesper has accumulated regarding Imperial family scandals. Material she has used for 15 years to ensure her actions remain protected regardless of how many people die in the process." The temperature in the judgment hall dropped to Arctic levels. Every noble present understood they were witnessing something that went beyond a simple treason trial. This was open warfare between a duke who had nothing left to lose and a woman who had spent decades accumulating power through methods the Empire had authorized but could not publicly acknowledge. The Emperor stood slowly, and the movement made everyone in the hall hold their breath. "You dare threaten the Imperial family with exposure?" "I dare tell the truth about who has been threatening the Imperial family," Caedric said. "I am not your enemy, Your Majesty. Duchess Vesper is. She has been blackmailing you for years, and you have let her commit atrocities to keep her silent. But silence has a price, and eventually that price becomes higher than exposure." The Emperor and Caedric stared at each other across the judgment hall, while 300 nobles watched political catastrophe unfold in real time. This was the moment where empires either adapted or collapsed, where truth either mattered or was crushed completely, where one young duke's gamble would either save his life or guarantee his death happened publicly enough to destabilize the entire northern territories. The Emperor sat back down slowly and turned his gaze to Vesper. "Duchess Valagrave," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made her face go pale. "Perhaps you would like to respond to these accusations before I decide how this trial proceeds." Vesper stood, and for the first time in 20 years, she looked uncertain. The control she had maintained through careful manipulation and calculated violence was slipping, and everyone in the hall could see it happening. "Your Majesty, these accusations are fabrications created by a desperate man facing execution. Then you would not mind if we conducted an investigation into your financial accounts?" The Emperor's tone was pleasant, which made it infinitely more dangerous. "A thorough investigation examining every transaction you have made on behalf of the Northern Territories over the past 2 decades? Vesper's mask finally shattered completely. She looked at the Emperor and understood that the leverage she had spent 15 years building had just become her own noose. If he investigated, he would find evidence of crimes even he could not protect. And if he found that evidence, he would have to sacrifice her to protect his own position. "I have served this empire faithfully," Vesper said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "You have served yourself," the Emperor said quietly, "using imperial authority as a shield. And I allowed it because your silence on certain matters benefited the throne. But Duke Caedric is correct about one thing. The price of your silence has become too high." He turned his attention back to Caedric and Seraphina, studying them with the calculating attention of someone reassessing a political equation. The charges against Duke Caedric Valagrave and Lady Seraphina are dismissed, the Emperor announced. Duchess Vesper Valagrave is stripped of all titles and exiled beyond imperial borders permanently. Her assets are seized by the crown. Any attempt to return will result in immediate execution. Vesper opened her mouth to protest, but imperial guards were already moving toward her. She looked at Caedric with hatred so pure it was almost physical. "You destroyed me," she said. "No," Caedric replied quietly. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone was watching when it happened." Guards removed Vesper from the hall, while she screamed threats and promises of revenge that would never be fulfilled. The nobles watched in stunned silence as 20 years of carefully maintained power collapsed in less than an hour. The Emperor gestured for Caedric and Seraphina to stand. Guards unbound their hands with efficiency that suggested this reversal had been anticipated. "You gambled your life on my willingness to sacrifice her instead of you," the Emperor said to Caedric. "That was either very brave or very foolish." "It was necessary," Caedric said. "Sometimes those are the same thing." The Emperor studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Return to Ravenwyck, Duke Valagrave. Rule your territories well. And remember that imperial mercy is extended once. There will not be a second time." "Understood, Your Majesty." The Emperor waved dismissal, and the audience was over. Caedric took Seraphina's hand and walked from the judgment hall, while 300 nobles watched them leave with expressions ranging from respect to fear to calculation about how this power shift would affect their own positions. They made it to the corridor outside before Seraphina finally spoke. "You risked everything on the assumption the Emperor would choose political stability over protecting Vesper." "Yes," Caedric said. "What if you were wrong? Then we would both be dead, and Vesper would have won. But I was not wrong. The Emperor is many things, but he is not stupid. Vesper had become more dangerous to keep than to remove. I just gave him public justification for doing what he already wanted." They walked through imperial corridors toward guest chambers where they would stay until their return to Ravenwyck could be arranged. Servants bowed as they passed, recognizing the shift in status from prisoners to vindicated nobles. In the privacy of their chambers, Seraphina finally allowed herself to collapse. Not from weakness, but from the release of tension she had been carrying since their arrest. Caedric caught her and held on while she shook with exhaustion and relief, and the overwhelming weight of having survived something that should have killed them. "We cannot go back to how things were," she said against his chest. "I know," Caedric said quietly. "Everything changes after this. The court will question whether I can be trusted. Nobles will test boundaries. And we will spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders waiting for whatever revenge Vesper manages from exile." "That is not what I meant," Seraphina pulled back to look at him. "I meant we cannot go back to being weapons aimed at each other. I meant we cannot go back to a marriage built on punishment and revenge. I meant we have to choose what we become next, and that choice has to be deliberate." Caedric studied her face in the fading afternoon light and felt that same tightness in his chest that terror and hope created when they existed in the same space. "Then what do we choose?" "To build something real out of ruins. To rule together instead of in isolation. To be the kind of leaders who remember what it costs when truth dies for convenience." She made it sound simple. It was not simple. It would be the hardest thing either of them had ever attempted, and they would fail repeatedly before they learned how. But standing in imperial chambers while winter light bled through windows, and their whole world remained balanced on the edge of catastrophe or salvation, Caedric made the choice that would define the rest of his life. "Agreed," he said. "We rebuild, together. And we become proof that weapons can learn gentleness without losing their edge." Seraphina reached up and touched his face with fingers that still trembled slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. "I'm still angry with you for the first 3 weeks of our marriage. I know. And I will probably be angry with you again for other things. I know that too." "Good," Seraphina said. "As long as we understand each other." Caedric kissed her then, and it felt like promise or prayer, or both woven together into something fragile that might become strong if they protected it carefully enough. Outside the windows, the capital city of Valdoria spread beneath them in winter twilight. Somewhere beyond imperial borders, Vesper plotted revenge that might or might not ever materialize. Somewhere in Ravenwyck, nobles and servants waited to see what kind of duke returned from a trial that should have ended in execution. But in this moment, Two people who had been forced into marriage as punishment had chosen to transform it into something voluntary. Not easy, not comfortable, but real in ways that political arrangements rarely achieved. The road ahead would be brutal. Power always demanded prices, and they had made themselves dangerous to the same system they needed to navigate. But they would face it together instead of divided, and that alone changed everything about what they might be capable of surviving. Duke Caedric Valagrave and his wife stood at the threshold of transformation, and whatever came next would be built on truth instead of lies, even if truth cost them everything they had spent years trying to protect. The journey back to Ravenwyck took 8 days through winter storms that seemed determined to match the violence brewing inside Caedric's chest. He sat in the carriage across from Seraphina, watching snow obliterate the landscape beyond frosted windows, and trying to calculate how many enemies they had made in the imperial court by forcing the emperor's hand. The answer was most of them. Nobles who had profited from Vesper's corruption. Council members who feared precedent that said blackmailers could be removed. Imperial officials who recognized that Caedric had just demonstrated exactly how to weaponize truth against power. They would all be planning retaliation already. Some of it would come as political maneuvering. Some would arrive as blades in darkness. And Caedric needed to be ready for both, while simultaneously proving to his own duchy that their duke had not become so unpredictable that stability itself was threatened. Leadership was control. Everyone knew that. But what people forgot was that control required choosing which battles to fight and which to lose strategically. And Caedric had just fought every battle simultaneously with his life as the wager. He had won this time. Winning twice was significantly harder when your enemies knew exactly what tactics you would employ. Seraphina watched him think with the careful attention of someone learning to read a language written in tension and silence. "You are planning for war," she said quietly. "I am planning for survival. In this empire, they are usually the same thing." The carriage hit a rut hard enough to jar them both. Outside, guards rode through snow with weapons visible and expressions that suggested they expected ambush at any moment. Thomas Greaves had sent word ahead that Ravenwyck was stable but tense, with several noble families demanding audiences immediately upon the Duke's return to explain exactly what had happened in the capital. When they finally crossed into northern territory, Caedric felt something in his chest loosen fractionally. This was his land, his people, his responsibility to protect regardless of what it cost him personally. The mountains rose ahead of them like sentinels carved from ancient stone, and Ravenwyck Castle perched on black cliffs looking exactly as forbidding as the day he had married Seraphina under imperial decree. That felt like years ago instead of weeks. Time compressed and expanded based on how much violence you survived in between moments of relative peace. The castle gates opened as their carriage approached. Servants lined the courtyard despite the freezing wind, waiting to see if their duke returned as prisoner or victor. Caedric stepped out first and offered his hand to Seraphina, making sure every witness saw them arrive together as equals rather than captor and captive. Lord Ravenscar stood near the entrance looking haggard and relieved in equal measure. "Your Grace," he said, bowing deeper than protocol required. "Welcome home. We feared the worst." "The worst was avoided," Caedric replied. "Barely. But we have work ahead of us." "Indeed." There are 12 nobles waiting in the council chamber demanding explanations. Lady Cordelia Thornwyck has been particularly vocal about stability concerns and your fitness to continue ruling. Of course she has, Caedric thought. Cordelia had been one of Vesper's closest allies and had profited enormously from duchy contracts awarded through corrupt channels. She would be terrified that Caedric's exposure of his aunt meant exposure of everyone connected to her schemes. "Tell them I will meet with the council tomorrow morning," Caedric said. "Tonight, I need to assess duchy security and ensure Ravenwyck is prepared for potential retaliation." "Retaliation from whom, Your Grace?" "Everyone who benefited from the system we just destabilized." Usik. The council meeting the next morning was exactly as hostile as Caedric expected. 12 nobles sat around the oak table in the war room, looking like people who had spent weeks constructing arguments and counter-arguments while their duke was on trial for treason. Lady Cordelia sat at the far end wearing deep blue velvet and an expression of carefully constructed concern that was pure theater. Caedric entered alone, leaving Seraphina to handle other duchy business. Some battles required demonstrating you could stand without support, even when support existed. He took his seat at the head of the table and waited for the attack to begin. "Your Grace," Lord Brennan started, "we are grateful for your safe return. However, Your recent actions in the capital have created significant concerns about duchy stability and your judgment regarding matters of imperial politics. My judgment prevented civil war and removed a corrupt influence that has been bleeding duchy resources for 2 decades, Caedric said flatly. If that concerns you, perhaps you should examine why stability built on theft and murder feels safer than stability built on truth. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. Lady Cordelia leaned forward with the predatory grace of someone moving in for a kill. Your Grace, we understand you were under tremendous pressure during your trial. However, your accusations against Duchess Vesper have damaged critical relationships with imperial officials. Trade agreements are being reconsidered. Military support that we relied upon is now uncertain. And several noble families are questioning whether the northern territories can be trusted to maintain imperial policy. Imperial policy that authorized murder and embezzlement, Caedric said. Are you suggesting I should have protected that system? I am suggesting, Cordelia replied with ice in her voice, that your marriage to the Arden girl has compromised your political judgment. Lady Seraphina had every reason to manipulate you into believing false narratives about her father. And you acted on that manipulation without considering consequences to the rest of us. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Caedric stood slowly, and every noble at the table recognized the danger in the movement. Say my wife's name correctly, or do not speak it at all, Caedric said quietly. And be very careful about your next words, Cordelia, because I am trying to be a better man than I was 3 weeks ago, but that effort has limits. Cordelia held his gaze without flinching. Whatever else she had courage. Misguided courage aimed in terrible directions, but courage nonetheless. I am simply stating what many nobles are thinking but are too afraid to say directly. Your judgment has been compromised. You need to consider annulling this marriage and restoring confidence that you can rule objectively. No, the word was absolute. Caedric walked around the table toward Cordelia with measured steps that made several nobles lean away from his path. I will clarify something for everyone in this room. My wife uncovered evidence of crimes that destroyed both our families. She risked her life searching for truth when everyone else accepted convenient lies. She stood beside me during a trial that could have ended in execution, and she has more courage and integrity than every person at this table combined. He stopped directly in front of Cordelia's chair and looked down at her with eyes that carried no mercy whatsoever. If anyone suggests annulment again, I will consider it an act of treason against the duchy and respond accordingly. Am I understood? Cordelia's composure finally cracked. She pushed her chair back and stood to face him, fury overriding self-preservation. You have become everything your aunt warned us about. Unpredictable, emotional, dangerous to the stability we all depend on. If you continue down this path, you will destroy the northern territories and everyone in them. Then leave, Caedric said. Pack your belongings and depart my duchy by sunset. I am done tolerating nobles who profited from corruption and now complain that exposing it was inconvenient. You cannot exile me without cause recognized by the emperor. I just gave cause. Questioning your duke's judgment publicly in council is grounds for removal. And after what happened in the capital, I suspect the emperor will be remarkably understanding about my need to consolidate loyalty among nobles I can trust. The room went silent. Other nobles stared at the confrontation with expressions ranging from shock to calculation. Lord Ravenscar looked like he wanted to intervene, but could not figure out how to do so without making things worse. Cordelia gathered her papers with shaking hands. She moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back with venom in her voice. This is not over, Your Grace. There are more of us than you realize. And we will not allow one duke's obsession with a traitor's daughter to destroy everything we built. She left before Caedric could respond, slamming the door hard enough that sound echoed through the castle corridors. The remaining nobles sat in stunned silence while their duke returned to his seat and tried to control the rage coursing through his veins. Anyone else wish to question my judgment or my marriage? He asked quietly. No one spoke. Lord Ravenscar finally cleared his throat. Your Grace, while I do not agree with Cordelia's methods, she represents a significant faction of nobles who are genuinely concerned about stability. If we lose too many supporters, the duchy becomes vulnerable to external threats. I know, Caedric said, exhaustion seeping into his voice, but I will not maintain stability by protecting the same corrupt system that killed my father. If nobles want to leave because I insist on basic integrity, then they were never truly loyal to begin with. Loyalty and fear are not the same thing, Lord Brennan said carefully. Your father understood that. He ruled through respect rather than terror. My father was murdered by someone who ruled through terror disguised as political necessity, Caedric replied. I am done pretending there is nobility in compromise with corruption. Either this duchy operates with integrity, or it does not deserve to exist. The statement hung in the room like a blade suspended over everyone's heads. These nobles had spent years navigating between power and survival, and Caedric had just told them that calculation was no longer acceptable. They would either commit to his vision or become enemies. There was no middle ground left. The meeting dissolved into tense discussions about specific duchy business, while everyone avoided the elephant sitting in the middle of the room. Their duke had just declared ideological war on pragmatism itself, and nobody knew if the duchy could survive that level of principle in an empire built on flexible morality. Asak. Seraphina found Caedric 3 hours later, standing on the battlements, staring out at mountains that disappeared into gray sky. Snow fell steadily, covering the landscape in white that made everything look clean and simple when reality was anything but. Greaves told me about the council meeting, she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. I exiled Cordelia. I heard. She deserved it. Probably. But now every noble who profited from Vesper's schemes knows I am purging anyone connected to the old system. They will unite against me out of self-preservation. Good, Seraphina said. Let them unite. Let them show themselves clearly so we know exactly who we are fighting. Caedric looked at her and saw determination in her expression that matched his own. This woman who had arrived at Ravenwyck as a political prisoner had transformed into someone willing to burn the entire duchy down if that was what integrity required. It was terrifying and inspiring in equal measure. We could lose everything, he said. We already lost everything. Our fathers, our families, years of our lives spent hating each other for crimes we did not commit. Seraphina's hand found his on the cold stone. Now we get to choose what we build from the ruins. And I would rather build something worth defending than maintain something rotten just because it is familiar. The wind picked up, carrying snow sideways across the battlements. Caedric pulled Seraphina closer. Both of them staring out at the duchy, they were either saving or destroying depending on perspective. Thomas Greaves appeared in the doorway behind them, his expression grave. Your Grace, riders approaching from the east. 20 armed men carrying banners from the Thornwick estate. Lady Cordelia appears to be returning with reinforcements. Caedric's jaw tightened. Of course she was. Exile only worked if the exiled person actually left, and Cordelia had made her entire career on refusing to accept consequences for her actions. Sound the alarm, Caedric ordered. Get every available guard to the courtyard. If Cordelia wants war, we will show her exactly what war looks like. Your Grace, Greaves said carefully, if you kill imperial nobles on duchy soil without proper cause, the Emperor will have grounds to intervene directly. She returned with armed men after being exiled. That is proper cause. Only if she attacks first. If her forces simply demand entry and you strike them down, it becomes murder of nobles rather than defense of duchy. Caedric stared at the old steward and recognized the trap being laid. Cordelia was forcing him to either back down from exile or commit an act aggressive enough to justify imperial intervention. Either way, she won by making him look weak or unstable. Then we do not strike first, Caedric said, but we make absolutely clear that entering Ravenwyck Castle armed and uninvited is an act of aggression we will respond to with lethal force. He turned to Seraphina. Stay inside. If this goes badly— I am staying beside you, Seraphina interrupted. We decided to build something together. That means standing together even when standing gets dangerous. Caedric wanted to argue. He wanted to lock her in the safest room in Ravenwyck and know she would survive regardless of what happened next. But he saw the determination in her eyes and understood that protecting her by removing her choice would destroy the partnership they were trying to build. Stay behind me, he said, and if blades come out, run. If blades come out, I fight. You do not know how to fight, then I will learn quickly. Despite everything, Caedric felt his mouth twitch towards something that might have been a smile if terror and pride were not occupying the same emotional space. You are either the bravest person I have ever met, or the most reckless. We established weeks ago that those are usually the same thing. They descended from the battlements together while guards scrambled to defensive positions throughout the castle. Servants were evacuated to interior chambers away from potential combat zones. Lord Ravenscar armed himself and took position near the main gates, looking like someone who had hoped retirement would arrive before civil war did. The riders reached Ravenwyck's outer walls as full darkness fell across the duchy. Torches illuminated Lady Cordelia at the head of 20 armed men, all wearing Thornwick colors and carrying weapons openly. She sat her horse like a general rather than a noblewoman, and her voice carried clearly through the cold air when she shouted toward the castle gates. Duke Caedric Valagrave, I am here under my rights as a duchy noble to demand formal hearing before exile can be enforced. Open your gates and allow me to present my case before witnesses as imperial law requires. Caedric stood atop the gatehouse, flanked by guards with crossbows aimed at the riders below. Seraphina stood slightly behind him, visible enough that everyone knew she was present, but protected enough that reaching her would require going through Caedric first. You were given cause for exile during council, Caedric called down. You questioned your duke's judgment publicly and suggested treason through incompetence. That is sufficient grounds under duchy law. Duchy law requires formal written notification and 3 days to prepare defense. You provided neither. Therefore, your exile is invalid, and I am within my rights to return with escort for protection during formal proceedings. It was a clever argument, and technically correct according to imperial legal standards. Caedric had acted impulsively during council without following proper protocol, and Cordelia was exploiting that gap to force a confrontation on her terms. Lord Ravenscar moved closer to Caedric and spoke quietly. She is correct about procedure, Your Grace. If we deny her entry now, she can petition the Emperor for intervention based on improper exile protocols. Then I will follow proper protocols, Caedric said. He raised his voice to carry down to Cordelia. You may enter with 5 men for formal hearing at dawn tomorrow. The remaining 15 will camp outside our walls until proceedings conclude. Any attempt to bring more than 5 armed men through these gates will be considered an act of war against the duchy. Cordelia smiled with all the warmth of a blade testing flesh. Acceptable. 5 men at dawn. I look forward to demonstrating exactly why your recent judgment has been compromised. She wheeled her horse and rode back toward her forces, leaving Caedric staring down at an army of 20 who would spend the night camped within sight of Ravenwyck's walls, a constant reminder that civil war was one bad decision away from becoming reality. Seraphina touched his arm gently. She is going to try to kill one of us during the hearing. I know, Caedric said. Either she murders me and claims self-defense during heated proceedings, or she murders you and claims I have become too unstable to rule after my wife's death. Either way, she positions herself to take control of the duchy with imperial backing. So what do? We prepare for war disguised as legal proceedings. And we make absolutely certain that if she tries violence, every witness survives to testify about who struck first. They returned to the castle interior while guards maintained watch through the night. Caedric spent hours reviewing duchy law and imperial precedent, searching for any regulation or loophole that would give him advantage during tomorrow's hearing. Seraphina sat nearby reading through old correspondence, looking for evidence that might demonstrate Cordelia's connection to Vesper's corruption schemes. Around midnight, Thomas Greaves entered the study carrying a single piece of paper. Your Grace, this arrived by courier an hour ago. It is from your sister. Caedric looked up sharply. He had not heard from his sister Alara in 3 years, not since she had been forced into marriage and moved to the Southern Territories. The fact that she was sending correspondence now, during a crisis, meant either she had heard about the trial or something else equally urgent had occurred. He took the letter and read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. My brother, Alara had written in handwriting that trembled slightly across the page. I heard about your trial and thank all powers that you survived, but I write with urgent warning. Vesper visited my household 2 weeks before your arrest. She claimed to be traveling for duchy business, but I overheard her speaking with my husband about contingencies in case you became problematic. She has resources hidden throughout the empire, allies we do not know about, and she swore that if she fell, she would ensure you fell with her. Be careful, Caedric. The woman who raised us is more dangerous in defeat than she ever was in power. Vesper Valagrave does not forgive, and she does not forget. The letter was signed with Alara's seal and a single line at the bottom. I am proud of the man you have become. Even if becoming him required more courage than anyone should need. Caedric set the letter down carefully and looked at Greaves. How extensive are Vesper's remaining resources? Unknown, Your Grace, but given 20 years of embezzlement and imperial connections, likely significant. And if Lady Cordelia is one of those resources, then tomorrow's hearing is not about legal proceedings, Caedric finished. It is about Vesper using Cordelia to destabilize the duchy in revenge for her exile. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Cordelia's timing was too perfect. Her willingness to risk open confrontation too bold. This was not one ambitious noble seizing opportunity. This was coordinated retaliation from someone who had spent decades building networks of loyal operatives throughout the northern territories. Vesper was still fighting, even from exile, and she was using Cordelia as her weapon the same way she had once used Caedric against the Arden family. "We need to cancel tomorrow's hearing," Seraphina said. "Evacuate the castle. Anything except walking into an obvious trap." "We cannot cancel without proof of conspiracy," Caedric replied. "And Vesper has spent 20 years ensuring her fingerprints never appear on anything incriminating. If I refuse the hearing, Cordelia goes to the Emperor claiming I am becoming a tyrant who ignores imperial law. And the Emperor uses that as justification to remove me and install someone more controllable. So we attend and prepare for assassination? We attend and prepare to expose whatever trap has been set." Caedric stood and moved to the window, staring out at torchlight from Cordelia's camp flickering in the darkness. "Then we use that exposure to demonstrate that every noble still connected to Vesper's network is a threat to duchy stability. Force the Emperor to choose between supporting attempted assassination or allowing me to purge corrupted elements from my own territory." "That is incredibly dangerous," Lord Ravenscar said from the doorway where he had been listening. "Yes," Caedric agreed, "but so is every other option. At least this way we control the battlefield." Dawn broke gray and cold over Ravenwyck Castle. Caedric stood in the formal hearing chamber wearing ceremonial armor under his formal robes, steel hidden beneath velvet in case ceremony transformed into combat. Seraphina stood beside him, dressed in deep green that made her look like something carved from northern forests, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. She wore a knife concealed in her sleeve, a small blade Caedric had given her 3 hours ago, with brief instructions on where to aim if violence began. Lady Cordelia entered with her 5 chosen men, all of them armed despite protocol suggesting weapons should be left at the door. She smiled when she saw the room packed with witnesses, nobles, guards, merchants, even servants who had been invited specifically to ensure whatever happened next occurred before an audience too large to silence. "Your Grace," Cordelia said with false courtesy, "how thorough of you to invite so many observers. One might think you do not trust my intentions." "One would be correct," Caedric replied. "Please state your case for why exile should be overturned." Cordelia moved to the center of the chamber while her 5 men positioned themselves strategically near exits. Caedric noticed the positioning immediately and made eye contact with Lord Ravenscar, who nodded fractionally. Guards shifted their own positions in response, blocking the exits Cordelia's men had targeted. "I argue that your recent judgment has been severely compromised by personal attachments," Cordelia began, her voice carrying through the chamber. "Your marriage to Lady Seraphina Arden was politically necessary, but has resulted in decisions that damage duchy interests. Your destruction of Duchess Vesper despite her decades of service, your accusations against imperial officials, your willingness to risk our relationship with the Emperor over historical grievances." "Those are not grievances," Seraphina said, her voice cutting through Cordelia's speech. "Those are murders, treason, corruption that stole from every person in this duchy for 20 years. You're hardly an objective source, girl. Your father was a convicted traitor. Your presence here is an insult to every loyal noble who watched him receive justice. My father was innocent. And so was Caedric's father. They were both murdered by Vesper Valagrave, who you served faithfully while profiting from duchy contracts awarded through bribery and corruption." Cordelia's mask slipped fractionally, showing fury underneath. "You dare accuse me of corruption without evidence?" "I have evidence," Seraphina said calmly. She pulled papers from inside her sleeve, documents she and Caedric had spent all night preparing. Financial records showing payments from Vesper to your estate. Correspondence discussing contract arrangements that bypassed normal duchy procedures. Testimony from merchants who were forced to inflate prices and split profits with your household. Cordelia went pale, then red. Her hand moved toward her waist where a blade was concealed beneath formal robes. "Those are forgeries. They are sealed records from imperial archives, authenticated by duchy record keepers who will testify under oath to their validity." The chamber erupted in whispers. Nobles who had supported Cordelia suddenly looked uncertain. Her 5 men shifted nervously, recognizing that the trap they had walked into was not the one they expected. Cordelia's composure shattered completely. She pulled her blade in one smooth motion and lunged toward Seraphina with killing intent written across her face. Caedric moved faster. He intercepted Cordelia's blade with his own weapon, steel ringing against steel loud enough to silence every voice in the chamber. Her 5 men drew weapons immediately, and suddenly the formal hearing had become exactly what Caedric predicted: assassination disguised as legal proceedings. "Stand down!" Caedric ordered Cordelia's men. "Your lady just committed treason by attacking a duchess during formal proceedings. Drop your weapons or join her in that charge." 3 of the men hesitated. 2 lunged forward anyway, forcing Ravenwyck guards to engage. The chamber descended into chaos as nobles scrambled away from combat and servants screamed, and Cordelia fought Caedric with skill that spoke of extensive training rather than casual nobility. She was good, better than most men Caedric had dueled over the years, but she was fighting with fury while he fought with cold precision born from 15 years of survival. And fury made people predictable. He disarmed her in 6 moves, sending her blade skittering across marble floor. Then he had his sword at her throat, while the chamber watched in stunned silence, and her remaining men were being subdued by guards with crossbows aimed at center mass. "Yield," Caedric said quietly. Cordelia looked up at him with hatred and something that might have been respect. "You were always going to win this," she said. "Vesper told me you were too dangerous to control once you stopped believing her lies." "Where is she?" Caedric demanded. "Where did Vesper go after exile?" Cordelia smiled with blood on her teeth. "Somewhere you will never find her. Somewhere she can build new networks and wait for the perfect moment to destroy everything you love. She has resources you cannot imagine and patience you will never match. And she promised me that even if I failed today, your victory would be temporary. Because weapons eventually turn on everyone, even their wielders." "Guards," Caedric said. "Take Lady Cordelia to the dungeons. Charge: attempted murder of a duchess, conspiracy against the duchy, and corruption during her tenure as noble advisor." Cordelia was dragged away, still smiling like she knew something Caedric did not. Her men were taken as well, leaving the hearing chamber stained with blood and filled with witnesses who had just watched their duke fight for his life during what should have been legal proceedings. Lord Ravenscar approached carefully. "Your Grace, are you injured?" "No." Caedric sheathed his blade and turned to find Seraphina. She stood near the wall looking pale but unharmed, the knife still concealed in her sleeve unused. He crossed to her and took her hands, feeling them tremble slightly despite her composed expression. "That was terrifying," she said. "Yes, but you stood your ground. I wanted to run, but you stayed." Caedric pulled her closer, uncaring what the remaining nobles thought about public affection. "That is courage. Doing the right thing despite terror rather than without it." The chamber began emptying as nobles and witnesses departed to spread word about what had just occurred. By nightfall, every household in the duchy would know Duke Caedric had survived assassination and exposed another of Vesper's agents. Some would see it as strength. Others would see it as evidence that the duchy was becoming too unstable to trust. Thomas Greaves approached with his usual quiet efficiency. "Your Grace, the Emperor will need to be informed immediately. Attempted murder of nobles during formal proceedings requires imperial notification within 24 hours. "Send word," Caedric said. "Include full testimony from every witness and all financial evidence against Cordelia. Make it clear this was coordinated retaliation from Vesper's remaining network rather than isolated incident. And Lady Cordelia? Hold her until the Emperor responds. If he demands her transfer to imperial custody, we comply. If he authorizes duchy justice, then she faces trial here for treason and corruption." Greaves nodded and departed to handle the correspondence. Seraphina looked up at Caedric with exhaustion and something else in her expression. "How many more of them are there? How many more nobles secretly loyal to Vesper waiting for chances to destroy us?" "I do not know," Caedric admitted. "But after today, any who remain will think very carefully before acting. We just demonstrated that exposing corruption and surviving assassination makes us stronger rather than weaker. That is a deterrent worth more than threats." They stood together in the empty hearing chamber while servants cleaned blood from marble floor and removed broken furniture from the brief fight. Outside, snow continued falling on the northern territories, covering everything in white that made violence look clean and simple when it was anything but. Caedric felt Seraphina lean against him with the exhaustion of someone who had spent hours prepared for death, and was only now processing that survival had actually occurred. "I need you to promise me something," she said quietly. "Anything. If Vesper comes back, if she returns with enough resources to actually threaten Ravenwyck, promise me you will not sacrifice yourself trying to protect me. Promise we face her together, or not at all." Caedric wanted to promise. He wanted to give Seraphina the reassurance she needed that he would not throw his life away trying to save hers. But they both knew he was lying if he made that promise, because protecting the people he loved was the only thing that gave his existence meaning after 15 years of building power with no purpose except revenge. "I promise to try," he said instead. "That is the best I can offer." Seraphina looked up at him and saw the truth in his expression. She reached up and touched his face with fingers that still trembled slightly. "Then I promise the same. We try to survive together, and if we fail, at least we fail having built something real instead of existing in isolation pretending we did not need anyone." They left the hearing chamber together as afternoon light bled through windows and castle servants whispered about the Duke who fought assassins during legal proceedings and the Duchess who stood beside him armed with evidence and concealed blades. Some stories were already transforming what happened into legend. Others focused on the blood and chaos and the concerning reality that Ravenwyck's stability depended entirely on one man's ability to survive repeated attempts on his life. But Caedric and Seraphina climbed to their chambers and barred the door and held each other with the desperate intensity of people who knew tomorrow might bring worse threats and all they had was this moment, this choice to face whatever came next together. Outside, in a camp beyond Ravenwyck's walls, messengers rode fast toward the southern territories carrying word to Vesper Valagrave that her assassination attempt had failed but her promise had been delivered. Weapons eventually turned on everyone, and Duke Caedric's victory would be temporary because some fights never truly end. They just paused between rounds, gathering strength for the next battle that would determine whether truth and integrity could actually survive in an empire built on convenient lies and strategic murders. And somewhere in exile beyond imperial borders, Vesper read those messages and smiled, and began planning the revenge that would either destroy her nephew completely or force him to become the very monster she had always wanted him to be. The storm was coming. Everyone could feel it building in the air like pressure before lightning strike. And when it finally broke across the northern territories, Duke Caedric Valagrave would face the choice that defined whether people could truly change or if weapons remained weapons, regardless of what they pretended to become. Winter deepened across the northern territories with the kind of cold that made breathing feel like swallowing knives. 3 weeks had passed since Cordelia's failed assassination, and Ravenwyck Castle existed in a state of vigilant tension that exhausted everyone living within its walls. Guards rotated shifts every 4 hours to prevent fatigue from compromising security. Servants moved through corridors in groups rather than alone. Nobles who remained loyal to Caedric started carrying weapons openly, understanding that court functions might transform into combat without warning. The Emperor's response to Cordelia's arrest had been characteristically calculated. He authorized duchy justice but sent imperial observers to witness the trial and report back on Caedric's handling of noble treason. The message was clear. You may execute your traitors, but we are watching to ensure you do not become the tyrant you claim to oppose. Caedric stood in the war room studying reports from scouts positioned throughout the northern territories. Most brought mundane information about trade routes and weather conditions, but 3 reports contained intelligence that made his blood run cold. Vesper had been spotted in the eastern borderlands meeting with mercenary companies. She was building an army, not a large one, but sufficient to destabilize Ravenwyck if employed strategically during moments of vulnerability. Lord Ravenscar read the same reports over Caedric's shoulder and made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a curse. She is not coming to negotiate, the old lord said quietly. She is coming to burn everything you built and salt the earth so nothing grows back. I know, Caedric replied. The question is when and where she strikes first, and whether we can survive long enough to strike back. Seraphina entered the war room carrying her own correspondence, letters from contacts she had been cultivating throughout the duchy over the past weeks. People who had suffered under Vesper's corruption and were now willing to provide intelligence in exchange for protection. She had transformed from political prisoner to active participant in duchy security, and watching her work reminded Caedric daily that strength came in forms beyond physical violence. I have confirmation from 3 separate sources, Seraphina said, spreading her letters across the table beside Caedric's reports. Vesper is planning to attack during the spring conclave. When every northern noble gathers in Ravenwyck for seasonal negotiations, she will strike with mercenaries disguised as visiting guards and hired servants. Maximum chaos with maximum witnesses to make it look like your duchy has descended into civil war. That is 2 months away, Lord Ravenscar said. Why would she wait that long? Because she wants the Empire watching when Ravenwyck falls, Caedric said, understanding the strategy immediately. If she attacks now, it looks like revenge from a disgraced exile. If she attacks during the conclave with Imperial observers present, it looks like Duke Caedric Valagrave has lost control of his own territory. The Emperor uses that as justification to remove me and install someone more stable, someone who happens to be sympathetic to Vesper's interests. So we cancel the conclave, Seraphina said. Deny her the opportunity. We cannot cancel without proof of specific threat. And if we do cancel, every noble in the Northern Territories questions why their duke is too afraid to host basic seasonal gatherings. Caedric leaned against the table, exhaustion seeping into his posture. We are trapped between vulnerability and perception of weakness, and Vesper knows it. Then we spring her trap first, Seraphina said. We identify her mercenaries before the conclave begins. We expose the plot publicly with evidence so overwhelming the Emperor has no choice but to authorize military action against her. That requires infiltrating her network, Lord Ravenscar pointed out, finding operatives we can turn or capture, gathering testimony that survives legal scrutiny. Then that is what we do, Caedric said. We have 2 months. We use every resource, every contact, every piece of leverage we possess to dismantle her operation before it can strike. And we do it quietly enough that she does not realize we know her plans until it is too late to adapt. The three of them stood around the war room table looking at maps and reports, and the daunting reality that survival required perfect execution of a strategy that had 1,000 points of potential failure. But doing nothing guaranteed destruction. So they began planning with the grim determination of people who understood that sometimes the only path forward required walking directly into danger and hoping you were faster than the blade waiting in darkness. The next 6 weeks became a study in controlled paranoia and strategic intelligence gathering. Caedric sent his most trusted agents into border towns and mercenary camps, posing as disgruntled duchy soldiers looking for better employment. 3 came back with names of captains Vesper had recruited. 1 came back with actual contracts bearing her signature and detailing payment structures for services rendered during the spring conclave. Seraphina coordinated with merchants and servants, building networks of eyes and ears throughout the territories who reported suspicious activities and unfamiliar faces. She discovered that Vesper had been positioning people inside Ravenwyck for months, placing them in roles so mundane nobody questioned their presence: stable hands, kitchen staff, laundry workers who could move through the castle without attracting attention. Lord Ravenscar handled the delicate task of vetting existing duchy nobles, identifying who could be trusted and who might be compromised by Vesper's influence. He found 4 nobles with suspicious financial connections and 6 more who had received correspondence from known Vesper operatives. Not enough to charge them with treason, but sufficient to exclude them from sensitive information and watch their movements carefully. By the time the spring conclave arrived, Caedric had assembled a comprehensive map of Vesper's network. Not complete, but thorough enough to identify her primary operatives and planned attack vectors. The question now was whether to prevent the attack entirely or allow it to begin before crushing it publicly with overwhelming force. Caedric chose the latter. Prevention left room for Vesper to claim persecution and gather support. But crushing an active attack before Imperial witnesses would demonstrate both the threat's reality and Caedric's capability to defend his territory. The conclave began on the first day of spring, with nobles arriving from across the northern territories. Caedric greeted each delegation personally, watching for signs of nervousness or anticipation that might indicate involvement in Vesper's plans. Most arrivals were routine, but 6 delegations brought unusually large guard contingents, and 3 of those contingents included faces Caedric's agents had identified as mercenaries hired by his aunt. The trap was set. Now came the waiting. Seraphina stood beside him during the opening ceremonies, looking composed despite the tension radiating from her posture. She wore deep blue that made her look like northern sky, and Caedric noticed several nobles studying her with the reassessment that came from watching someone transform from victim to force in their own right. How many of them know what is coming? she whispered during a lull in ceremonies. Enough to make this dangerous, not enough to stop it. And the Imperial observers? Positioned where they will have clear sightlines when violence begins. Caedric kept his expression neutral despite discussing potential combat. They need to witness the attack firsthand, or Vesper's people will claim we manufactured the threat, so we wait for someone to try killing us. Yes, though I would prefer they try killing me specifically. You are supposed to stay in the interior chambers once festivities conclude. Seraphina gave him a look that suggested exactly what she thought of that plan. We established that I stand beside you. That includes when standing becomes dangerous. The argument was interrupted by the arrival of the final delegation, a group from the Far Eastern Territories led by Duchess Miriam Blackthorn. Caedric had not seen Miriam in 5 years, not since she had diplomatically avoided choosing sides during his initial rise to power. She approached the high table with practiced grace and bowed with exact protocol. "Your Grace," she said, "thank you for hosting the conclave despite recent difficulties." Recent difficulties was a masterclass in understatement. Caedric inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Duchess Blackthorn, your presence honors Ravenwyck." Miriam's eyes flicked to Seraphina with interest that seemed genuine rather than calculating. And this must be the Duchess who discovered what so many of us failed to see. "Lady Seraphina, your courage has become legendary throughout the territories." Seraphina accepted the compliment with wariness born from weeks of distinguishing genuine respect from veiled hostility. "Courage or recklessness, depending on who you ask," Duchess Blackthorn. "Often the same thing in practice," Miriam agreed. She leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice. "Your Grace, might I request private audience before tonight's banquet? I have information regarding security concerns that would be best discussed away from general attendance." Caedric studied her expression and saw something there that made every instinct scream warnings. But refusing would be insulting. An insult at this stage might push uncertain nobles toward Vesper's camp. "Of course. My private study in 1 hour." Miriam bowed again and withdrew, leaving Caedric and Seraphina exchanging glances that communicated entire conversations without words. "Trap?" Seraphina asked quietly. "Probably, but also possibly genuine intelligence. We will bring guards and keep the meeting short. And if she tries something? Then we demonstrate why attacking a duke in his own castle is strategically inadvisable." Found. The meeting took place exactly as scheduled, with 4 guards positioned outside Caedric's study, and 2 more hidden behind tapestries inside the room itself. Miriam entered alone, declined wine when offered, and got directly to the point with efficiency Caedric found either admirable or suspicious depending on what came next. "Your aunt contacted me 6 weeks ago," Miriam said without preamble. "She offered significant financial incentives to position myself near you during the conclave and create opportunities for her operatives to strike during moments of distraction." Caedric's hand moved fractionally toward his blade before stopping. "And you are telling me this? Why?" "Because I spent 3 years watching Vesper Valagrave destroy anyone who became inconvenient, and I have no intention of becoming another of her casualties." Miriam's expression was hard and practical. "You exposed her crimes publicly. You forced the Emperor to act. That makes you more dangerous to work against than to support, and I am nothing if not practical about my survival. So you came to offer intelligence in exchange for protection. I came to offer intelligence in exchange for the understanding that when Vesper's attack begins, my delegation will defend Ravenwyck rather than stand aside. I want it known that House Blackthorn chose the winning side when choices still mattered." The mercenary honesty was almost refreshing after weeks of navigating coded language and political theater. Caedric leaned back in his chair and studied Miriam with the attention usually reserved for chess opponents. "What specific intelligence do you have?" "Vesper plans to strike during tonight's banquet. Multiple assassination attempts coordinated to create maximum chaos. Primary targets are you and Lady Seraphina. Secondary targets are any nobles vocally loyal to your reforms. Her mercenaries will pose as servants during the banquet. They will use poison and wine for Seraphina and direct violence for you during toasts when attention is divided and weapons are supposedly secured. That is extremely detailed intelligence. I was supposed to help coordinate." Vesper sent encrypted correspondence with timing and target assignments. Miriam pulled papers from inside her formal robes and placed them on Caedric's desk. "I brought copies. You will find her signature and seal on the originals still in my possession." Caedric read the documents quickly, his expression darkening with each line. The plans were comprehensive and brutal. Vesper had spent months preparing this strike, and if Miriam had not turned, the attack would have succeeded through sheer coordination and surprise. "Why betray her now?" Caedric asked. "What changed between 6 weeks ago when she contacted you and today when you decided to turn?" Miriam met his gaze with something that might have been respect or calculation, or both woven together. "I watched you fight Lady Cordelia during formal proceedings. I saw you expose corruption, despite knowing it would make you vulnerable to retaliation. And I realized something your aunt never understood. True power is not maintaining control through fear. True power is being strong enough to risk everything for principle and surviving anyway. That kind of strength deserves support, if only because opposing it is likely fatal." The pragmatism was brutal and honest in equal measure. Caedric nodded slowly and made a decision that was either brilliant or catastrophic. "You will attend tonight's banquet as planned. You will not alert anyone that the assassination plot has been compromised. When Vesper's operatives move to strike, my guards will respond with overwhelming force. You and your delegation will defend the nobles nearest to you and assist in subduing any attackers who attempt escape. And if something goes wrong, then we improvise. But House Blackthorn's loyalty today will be remembered tomorrow when I redistribute duchy contracts and political appointments. Understood, Your Grace." Miriam stood and bowed. "I hope we both survive to see that tomorrow." She left the study, and Caedric sat in silence for 30 seconds before Seraphina emerged from the hidden passage where she had been listening to the entire conversation. "Do you trust her?" Seraphina asked. "No. But her intelligence matches what our own agents discovered, and her motives are transparent enough to be credible." Caedric stood and moved to the window, staring out at the castle grounds where nobles wandered between buildings enjoying spring weather. "Tonight, we end this. Either Vesper's network collapses completely or we die trying to collapse it. There are worse ways to die than fighting for something real. I can think of several I would prefer," Caedric said dryly. "But yes, if we must die, at least it will be together defending something we built instead of separately defending nothing at all." Seraphina crossed to stand beside him, both of them watching nobles who had no idea they were walking through the final hours before violence erupted across the conclave. "I am not ready to die," she said quietly. "I finally found something worth living for. Dying now feels like terrible timing." Caedric took her hand and squeezed once, firm and certain. "Then we make sure tonight ends with us alive and Vesper's revenge in ruins. We have advantages she does not account for. Knowledge of her plans, loyal guards, imperial observers who will witness her treachery firsthand. And most importantly, we have each other, which means we fight with something beyond survival instinct driving us forward." "Love makes people reckless," Seraphina observed. "Yes, but it also makes them fight harder than self-preservation alone ever could. And tonight that recklessness might be exactly what saves us." On. The banquet hall glittered with enough candles to make the entire room feel like captured firelight. 300 nobles filled long tables arranged in careful hierarchy. Eating food prepared by kitchen staff, Caedric's people had vetted 6 times for potential poisoners. Musicians played in corners while servants moved between tables, refilling wine and removing dishes with practiced efficiency. Caedric sat at the high table with Seraphina on his right, and imperial observers positioned strategically where they could witness everything that occurred. He had identified 12 servants who matched descriptions of Vesper's mercenaries, all of them moving through the hall with the controlled awareness of trained fighters pretending to be domestic staff. The first assassination attempt would come during toasts. Caedric had arranged for those toasts to happen exactly on schedule, giving Vesper's operatives no reason to suspect their plans had been compromised. Lord Ravenscar stood to offer the traditional spring blessing, his voice carrying through the hall with ceremonial gravity. As he spoke, Caedric watched the identified mercenaries shift positions subtly, moving closer to targets and preparing weapons hidden in service trays and beneath formal clothing. Seraphina's hand found his under the table, squeezing once in silent communication. She was ready. He squeezed back. So was he. Ravenscar finished his blessing and raised his wine glass. The entire hall stood in response, 300 nobles lifting glasses in synchronized motion. In that moment of divided attention, Vesper's mercenaries moved. 2 lunged toward Caedric from opposite directions with blades drawn. 3 more moved toward Seraphina and nearby loyal nobles. 5 positioned themselves at exits to prevent escape. It was coordinated and professional, the kind of attack that should have succeeded through pure surprise and overwhelming numbers. But Caedric's guards had been waiting for this exact scenario. They moved before the mercenaries reached their targets, intercepting blades with their own weapons and transforming the elegant banquet hall into a battlefield in the span of 3 heartbeats. Chaos erupted. Nobles screamed and scrambled for exits. Guards shouted orders while engaging attackers. Imperial observers watched with expressions of shock that quickly transformed into focused assessment as they recognized an attempted massacre rather than random violence. Caedric killed the first mercenary who reached him with efficiency born from 15 years of survival, his blade opening the man's throat before the attacker could complete his strike. The second mercenary proved more skilled, forcing Caedric into actual swordplay that would have been fatal if Lord Ravenscar had not intervened with his own blade, driving the attacker backward into waiting guards who subdued him with brutal efficiency. Seraphina fought her own battle with the small knife Caedric had given her weeks ago, using it more as deterrent than weapon while backing toward guards who protected her from 3 mercenaries attempting coordinated strikes. She did not kill anyone, but she wounded 2 badly enough that they broke off their attack, and that was sufficient. Duchess Miriam kept her word. Her guards defended nearby nobles and assisted Ravenwyck forces in subduing attackers attempting to reach exits. House Blackthorn's loyalty was demonstrated through blood and steel before witnesses who would remember exactly who stood with the Duke when assassination came to his halls. The fight lasted 4 minutes. 4 brutal, chaotic minutes of steel and screaming and nobles discovering exactly how thin the veneer of civilization became when violence entered spaces designed for diplomacy. When it ended, 9 mercenaries lay dead or captured, and the banquet hall looked like something from battlefield reports rather than formal gathering. Caedric stood in the center of the carnage, breathing hard and bleeding from a cut along his forearm he did not remember receiving. Seraphina stood nearby, flanked by guards, her dress torn and her face spattered with someone else's blood, but her eyes fierce and alive. The Imperial observers remained in their positions, expressions ranging from shock to calculation as they processed what they had just witnessed. Caedric raised his voice to carry through the hall, despite exhaustion making every word feel like lifting stones. What you witnessed tonight was coordinated assassination ordered by Vesper Valagrave, former Duchess of this territory, current exile attempting to destabilize the northern regions through murder and chaos. The attackers will confess under questioning, and their testimony will be provided to Imperial authorities as evidence of treason against Duchy and Empire both. He gestured toward the captured mercenaries being held by guards. I did not manufacture this threat. I did not create danger to justify expanded authority. I simply refused to die quietly when corruption demanded it. And I will continue refusing as long as necessary to protect this duchy and everyone within it. The speech was delivered to nobles and observers, but aimed at the Emperor himself through his representatives. The message was clear. Vesper Valagrave had attempted mass murder before Imperial witnesses. Either the Emperor authorized military action against her, or he demonstrated that Imperial justice was meaningless when politically inconvenient. One of the Imperial observers, a stern man named Marcus who held significant influence in the capital, stepped forward. Duke Valagrave, we will report exactly what we witnessed tonight to His Imperial Majesty. This was clear and undeniable treason by an exile attempting to destabilize Imperial territories. I expect the Emperor will authorize full military response within the week. Caedric inclined his head in acknowledgement, relief and exhaustion warring for control of his expression. Thank you. Your testimony will help ensure justice actually occurs rather than being delayed until politically convenient. Marcus looked at Caedric with something that might have been respect. You have proven yourself dangerous in ways the Empire was not prepared for, Your Grace. Dangerous to corruption, dangerous to convenient lies, dangerous to anyone who believes power should operate without accountability. That will make you enemies in the capital, but it will also make you essential, because empires built entirely on convenient lies eventually collapse from their own weight. The observer withdrew with his colleagues, leaving Caedric standing amid wreckage and noble witnesses who had spread word about this night throughout the territories and beyond. Lord Ravenscar approached with a cloth for Caedric's wounded arm. That was closer than I would prefer, Your Grace. Yes, Caedric agreed, but we survived. And more importantly, we now have Imperial authorization to end Vesper permanently. If she does not end us first, she will know her attack failed within hours, and she will be planning something worse. Then we strike before she can plan. We use the Emperor's authorization to hunt her with military force. We end this war before it consumes everything we built. The Emperor's authorization arrived 5 days later, carried by fast courier and bearing seals that left no room for misinterpretation. Vesper Valagrave was declared enemy of the Empire. Her exile upgraded to execution order, and Duke Caedric Valagrave was granted full military authority to pursue and eliminate her by any means necessary. Caedric assembled his forces with the grim efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment since the night Vesper was first exiled. 200 trained soldiers, 50 mounted cavalry, and 3 of his most skilled agents who knew the eastern borderlands where Vesper was last sighted. He prepared to leave at dawn, which meant spending the final evening with Seraphina in chambers that no longer felt like separate territories but shared space they had, built together through violence and honesty, and the terrifying choice to care about each other despite everything that made caring dangerous. "I want to come with you," Seraphina said as he packed weapons and provisions. "No." "Caedric, no," he repeated, stopping to face her fully. "This is not protection disguised as control. This is recognition that someone needs to hold Ravenwyck if I do not return, someone the nobles trust, someone who understands both duchy politics and the reforms we are trying to implement. That someone is you." Seraphina looked at him with frustration and understanding mixing in her expression. "I hate that you are right, I know, but hating something does not make it less true." He crossed to where she stood and pulled her close, feeling her arms wrap around him with the fierce grip of someone memorizing the shape of another person in case memory became all that remained. "Come back," she whispered against his chest. "I finally found someone worth keeping. Losing you now would break something I am not sure can be repaired." "I will come back," Caedric promised, "because I finally have something worth returning to, and I am not giving that up without fighting for it with everything I possess." They stood together in lamplight while the castle settled into night around them. Outside, winter was finally releasing its grip on the northern territories, and spring was bringing the kind of cold rain that washed away snow and left earth exposed. Renewal and exposure happening simultaneously, which felt appropriate for everything they had survived together. At dawn, Caedric rode out with his forces while Seraphina watched from the battlements, her figure growing smaller as distance accumulated between them. He looked back once before the road curved away, memorizing the sight of her standing strong and certain on walls they now defended together. The hunt for Vesper took 2 weeks of tracking through borderland territories where loyalty shifted based on who offered better payment. Caedric's agents proved invaluable, identifying informants and contacts who provided intelligence about Vesper's movements. She was running, but not fleeing. She was positioning herself for one final strike, gathering remaining resources and loyal operatives for an assault that would either destroy Caedric completely or exhaust her last reserves trying. They found her camp in eastern mountains where winter still clung to high altitudes with stubborn determination. 50 mercenaries surrounded by defensible terrain, and Vesper herself visible through the camp, moving among her forces with the confidence of someone who believed this war was still winnable. Caedric positioned his forces for assault just before dawn, the traditional timing for attacks that relied on surprise and overwhelming force. But before signal could be given, a single figure emerged from Vesper's camp, walking toward Ravenwyck forces with hands raised in clear gesture of parley. It was Vesper herself, unarmed, unguarded, walking across open ground like someone who had decided conversation was worth the risk of arrows or treachery. Caedric rode forward to meet her, bringing 4 mounted guards but keeping his own weapon sheathed. They met in the space between armies, with dawn breaking gray and cold across the eastern mountains. "Nephew," Vesper said, and her voice carried the same cold certainty he remembered from childhood. "You came personally. I wondered if you would send subordinates instead." "This needed to be finished personally," Caedric replied. "Too much history between us to delegate resolution." "History." Vesper smiled without warmth. "I raised you after your parents died. I fed you when you were starving. I taught you everything you needed to survive in an empire that devours the weak, and you repay that by destroying everything I built. You built your power on my father's murder and convenient lies. You used me as a weapon for 2 decades while stealing from the duchy and blackmailing the emperor." Caedric kept his voice level, despite fury rising in his chest. "What did you expect when I finally learned the truth? I expected you to be pragmatic, to understand that power requires compromise with morality, to become the ruler this duchy needed instead of the idealist your father was. My father was a good man who died opposing your crimes. Your father was a fool who prioritized truth over survival. And you were becoming strong enough to replace that foolishness with effective ruthlessness until that girl convinced you feelings mattered more than authority. Her name is Seraphina, my wife, my duchess, the person who saved me from becoming the weapon you created. Vesper's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment or disgust or both. Then you are beyond saving. I came to offer final terms. Exile me permanently with sufficient resources to live comfortably, and I disappear forever. You keep your duchy and your principles and your precious marriage, or refuse, and I spend whatever remains of my life ensuring yours ends in fire. The threat was delivered calmly, like discussing weather patterns rather than mutual destruction. Caedric studied the woman who had raised him, taught him, shaped him into the person he became before Seraphina showed him alternatives existed. 15 years ago, I would have accepted those terms, Caedric said quietly. I would have chosen pragmatic peace over principled war. But I am not that person anymore, and the duchy I am building cannot rest on foundations of convenient compromise with evil. He pulled the imperial execution order from inside his cloak and held it where Vesper could see the seals. The emperor declared you enemy of the empire. I have authorization to end this by any means necessary. Your mercenaries can surrender and face justice or die fighting. But you do not get exile, you do not get comfortable disappearance. You answer for what you did to our families and everyone else you destroyed building your empire of lies. Vesper stared at the execution order, and for the first time since Caedric had known her, she looked uncertain. Not afraid, but uncertain whether the nephew she had created had truly transformed into someone she no longer controlled. You realize this makes you exactly what I always wanted, she said, ruthless enough to kill family for principle, hard enough to deliver justice without mercy. Everything I tried to create through manipulation, you became through opposition. No, Caedric said. What you wanted was a weapon you controlled. What I became is a man who chooses his own targets. There is a difference, and that difference is everything. He turned his horse back toward his forces, the parley concluded. Surrender or die, Aunt Vesper. Those are the only options remaining. Vesper did not respond immediately. She stood in the space between armies while dawn light grew stronger across mountain peaks. Then she smiled with something that looked almost like pride. I trained you too well, nephew. You will be a magnificent duke, terrifying and effective in equal measure. Just remember that weapons turn on everyone eventually, even wielders who think they have become something else. She walked back toward her camp without waiting for response, and Caedric returned to his forces knowing the conversation had been final goodbye disguised as negotiation. The assault came 30 minutes later when Vesper's mercenaries refused surrender and chose battle instead. It was brutal and efficient. 200 trained soldiers against 50 mercenaries defending indefensible terrain. The outcome was never uncertain, only the cost. Caedric led the assault personally because some fights required presence rather than delegation. He killed 3 men in direct combat, wounded 5 more, and reached Vesper's position as her remaining forces collapsed around her. She stood in the center of chaos, holding a blade she barely knew how to use, waiting for whatever came next with the stoic acceptance of someone who had planned for this possibility and found themselves unsurprised by its arrival. Make it quick, she said. I owe you that much for making you into what you are. Caedric raised his blade and hesitated. Not from mercy. From recognition that killing family, even family who had destroyed everything, carved permanent marks into the soul that never fully healed. Some violence was necessary. That did not make it painless. You destroyed my father and Seraphina's father, he said quietly. You stole decades of lives from people who did nothing except oppose your crimes. You turned me into a weapon aimed at innocent people, and you did it all believing power justified everything. His blade moved in one clean strike, and Vesper Valagrave died before she could respond. Quick and efficient, which was more mercy than she had shown anyone, but was also the only ending Caedric could live with afterward. He stood over her body while fighting concluded around him and tried to feel something beyond exhausted relief that this war was finally, permanently finished. But emotion would not come, just vast emptiness where fury had lived for 15 years, and uncertainty about what filled that space when vengeance was complete and you still had to continue existing. Lord Ravenscar found him standing there 20 minutes later, blood-covering armor and expression distant. Your Grace, all enemy forces subdued. We have prisoners for questioning. What are your orders? Tend the wounded. Secure prisoners for transport to Ravenwyck. Send word to the Duchess that we were successful and will return within the week. And Vesper's body? Burn it here. No ceremony. No burial in family crypts. Drashi. She forfeited that when she murdered my father. Ravenscar nodded and moved away to organize cleanup. Caedric stood alone in the aftermath of violence that had defined half his life and felt nothing except exhaustion and the desperate need to return to Seraphina and see if the person he had become through this war was still capable of building rather than only destroying. Anitis. The journey back to Ravenwyck took longer than the journey out because they carried wounded and prisoners, and the weight of knowing a 20-year war had finally ended. Soldiers sang marching songs to keep spirits high. Caedric rode in silence, replaying every moment of the final confrontation and wondering if he had made choices his father would recognize, or if he had become exactly what Vesper predicted. Ruthless enough to be effective, but so changed by violence that humanity became performance rather than nature. They crested the final hill overlooking Ravenwyck Castle on the 7th day of their return journey. The sight of black towers against spring sky made something in Caedric's chest loosen fractionally, tension he had been carrying for weeks finally releasing its grip. Seraphina met him in the courtyard surrounded by nobles and servants who had gathered to witness their duke's return. She did not wait for formal greetings or ceremony. She ran to him as he dismounted and wrapped her arms around him with fierce intensity that communicated everything words could not capture. "You came back," she said against his chest. "I promised I would. Promises made before battles do not always survive the fighting." "This one did," Caedric said, pulling back enough to see her face. "It is over. Vesper is dead. Her network is dismantled. The Emperor is satisfied. We can finally start building without waiting for the next assassination attempt." Seraphina searched his expression with the careful attention of someone checking for wounds that did not bleed externally. "Did it cost you?" she asked quietly. "Killing her?" "Yes," Caedric admitted. "Not because I regret the necessity, but because even justified violence leaves marks. I am different than when I left, and I'm not certain if that difference makes me better or worse at being the person you need beside you." Seraphina touched his face with fingers that trembled slightly. "I do not need you to be perfect. I need you to be honest about what you carry and willing to let me help carry it. We survived the war. Now we survive the peace, which is sometimes harder because there are no clear enemies to fight, and the damage lives inside rather than outside." They stood together in the courtyard while nobles watched and servants whispered, and the entire duchy witnessed their duke and duchess choosing each other again after violence had tried to tear them apart. That night they sat together in chambers that had transformed from separate territories into shared sanctuary. Caedric told Seraphina everything about the final battle, the conversation with Vesper, the moment of hesitation before his blade fell. She listened without judgment, understanding that some stories needed telling more than they needed response. When he finished, exhausted and emptied of words, Seraphina took his hand. "You spent 15 years becoming a weapon because you thought that was the only way to survive. Now you get to spend however long it takes becoming a person again, and I will be here through all of it. The good days when building feels natural, the hard days when destroying still feels easier. All of it. I do not know how to be anything except what I became," Caedric said quietly. "Then we learn together, because I do not know how to be a duchess who rules rather than survives. We are both figuring out who we are after trauma, and that is enough. Being in process, choosing better even when better is harder." The weeks that followed became studies in deliberate reconstruction. Caedric worked with Lord Ravenscar to redistribute duchy contracts fairly rather than based on corruption. Seraphina organized programs to support families who had suffered under Vesper's schemes, returning stolen funds and providing restitution where possible. Together they held audiences where common people could petition their duke directly rather than through layers of nobles who demanded bribes for access. It was exhausting work. Some days Caedric wanted nothing except to return to simple efficiency of violence solving problems. But Seraphina was there during those moments, reminding him that complexity meant growth, and growth meant becoming something more than the weapon Vesper had created. 6 months after Vesper's death, on a summer evening when warmth finally reached northern territories fully, Caedric stood on the battlements with Seraphina watching sunset paint mountains in gold and crimson. The duchy spread below them in patterns of fields and villages and trade routes that connected hundreds of lives depending on their leadership. I spent 15 years believing power was control, Caedric said quietly. Controlling enemies, controlling circumstances, controlling myself so thoroughly that feeling anything became dangerous. And now? Seraphina asked. Now I think power is accepting you cannot control everything and building anyway. Choosing to care despite knowing care creates vulnerability. Trusting people even when trust risks betrayal. He turned to face her fully, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. I think power is standing on battlements with my wife, and knowing that if I lost her, I would burn the world down, and choosing every single day not to become the person who would do that. Choosing to be human despite how much safer it felt being a weapon. Seraphina reached up and touched his face with the gentle attention of someone handling something precious and fragile. You are allowed to be both, human and dangerous, gentle and capable of violence. Those things are not contradictions. They are balance. I do not feel balanced. Most days I feel like I am pretending to be functional while barely holding chaos at bay. Welcome to being human, Seraphina said with a small smile. We are all pretending and barely holding together. The difference is you are doing it while actually building something worth protecting instead of just destroying threats before they materialize. They stood together as darkness fell across the northern territories and stars emerged one by one in sky that stretched infinite above the duchy. They were learning to lead through principle rather than fear. It was not easy. Some days it felt impossible. But impossible was familiar territory for both of them, and they had learned through violence and honesty that impossible just meant harder rather than genuinely unachievable. In the great hall below, nobles gathered for evening meal without weapons or suspicion that assassination might interrupt dinner. Servants moved freely without fear that mistakes meant execution. Common people could approach the castle with petitions knowing they would receive hearing rather than dismissal. The changes were small individually, but accumulated into transformation that made Ravenwyck feel like somewhere people lived rather than somewhere they survived. Caedric pulled Seraphina closer as wind picked up across the battlements, both of them staring out at the duchy that was becoming something neither vengeance nor corruption could claim. My father wanted to build a just empire, Caedric said. He died before he could. Maybe we can finish what he started. Not an empire. Just one duchy where truth matters more than convenience and people are protected rather than exploited. That is a beautiful goal that will probably destroy us through sheer difficulty, Seraphina observed. Probably. But I would rather die building something beautiful than live comfortably maintaining something rotten. Then we build, Seraphina agreed, until we succeed or die trying. And we do it together because neither of us survives alone what we can endure together. Above Ravenwyck Castle, stars continued emerging while darkness deepened. Somewhere in the duchy, families were gathering for evening meals. Somewhere else, merchants were calculating fair trades rather than inflated prices demanded through corruption. Throughout the territories, people were learning that leadership could mean protection rather than exploitation, and that learning was slow and fragile and worth every effort required to maintain it. Duke Caedric Valagrav had spent 15 years becoming a weapon. He would spend the rest of his life learning to be human again. Some days that meant gentleness. Some days it meant necessary violence to protect what he built. Most days it meant exhausting work of governance without clear enemies to fight. Just endless decisions about how to balance justice and mercy and survival in a world that demanded all three simultaneously. But he would do it beside Seraphina, the woman who had refused to break when he tried to break her, who had searched for truth when everyone accepted lies, who stood beside him through assassination and war, and the terrifying vulnerability of actually caring whether tomorrow arrived safely. They were not perfect. They were barely functional most days, but they were choosing each other, and choosing integrity, and choosing to build something that might outlast them if they protected it carefully enough. And in an empire built on convenient lies and strategic murders, that choice alone was revolutionary enough to matter. Not just for themselves, but for everyone who watched and wondered if different ways of living were actually possible or if survival always required becoming monsters who occasionally remembered they were human. Ravenwyck Castle stood against northern mountains as it had for centuries, bearing witness to another chapter in the endless story of broken people learning to build something better from ruins left by those who came before. And for the first time in 20 years, the castle felt less like a prison and more like a home where weapons were learning to become gardeners without forgetting how to fight when fighting was necessary. The Duke and Duchess stood together on battlements while stars watched overhead, and whatever came next They would face it side by side. Not because it was easy, but because some things were worth fighting for, even when fighting required becoming gentler rather than harder, and love was the most dangerous and necessary of all the weapons they had learned to wield.